There is a question that has haunted naval historians, strategists, and students of the Second World War for more than 80 years. Not a question about who won, but about what almost changed everything. Two ships, built from the same blueprint, launched from the same era, crewed by the same empire. They were not the biggest warships that ever sailed. They were not the most heavily armed. But across the breadth of the Pacific, from the frozen wind above Pearl Harbor to the hot, oil-slicked waters off the Philippine coast, no two ships shaped the arc of the entire naval war in the Pacific quite the way these did. This is their story. If you have stumbled upon this video at the end of a long day, or you are settling in for a night of deep history, welcome. Pour yourself something warm. Get comfortable. Because what you are about to hear is not a highlight reel. This is the full story, 3 hours and counting. We are going back to the very beginning, to the drawing boards of 1936, to the shipyards of Yokosuka and Kawasaki, to the moment Japan decided to build something the world had never seen before. And we are going to follow these two ships, the Shōkaku and the Zuikaku, through every campaign, every storm, every near miss and catastrophic loss, all the way to the end. Stay with us. Hit the like button if you enjoy long-form history. Subscribe if you want more of this. And if you fall asleep somewhere around Chapter 4, no judgment at all. We will be right here when you wake up. The story only gets more extraordinary from here. Chapter 1. The World That Built Them. Imperial Japan before the carriers. To understand the Shōkaku and the Zuikaku, you have to understand the world that made them necessary. Not just the world of the 1930s, the world of the 1920s, when the great naval powers of the world sat down at a conference table in Washington and tried, with elaborate formulas and firm handshakes, to prevent the next war by controlling how many warships each nation was allowed to build. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was, in many ways, the most ambitious arms control agreement the modern world had yet attempted. 5 nations, the United States, Britain, Japan, France, and Italy, agreed to strict limits on warship tonnage, on the size of battleships, on the number of aircraft carriers any one navy could operate. On paper, it was an act of collective restraint. In practice, for Japan, it was something else entirely. Japan had entered the 20th century as a rising naval power. The war against Russia in 1904 and 1905 had shocked the world. An Asian navy had crushed a European fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, and the lesson was not lost on anyone. Japan understood, as few other nations did at the time, that sea power was not just a tool of commerce, it was the spine of national survival. An island nation with virtually no domestic oil, dependent on imported steel, rubber, and raw materials carried across thousands of miles of open ocean. Japan's relationship with the sea was not strategic. It was existential. Every ton of warship the Washington Treaty denied her was, in the Japanese naval mind, a direct threat to that existence. The treaty ratios were the specific humiliation. The agreed capital ship ratio allocated the United States and Britain 5 units each for every 3 units allowed to Japan. To the admirals in Tokyo, this was not a formula, it was a verdict. It said, in the polished diplomatic language of the era, you are a lesser power. Japan accepted the terms, signed the documents, and spent the next decade looking for ways to extract maximum fighting power from the ships she was permitted to build. What emerged from that pressure was a design philosophy unlike anything being pursued in London or Washington, a willingness to sacrifice crew comfort, reserve buoyancy, and peacetime safety margins in pursuit of range, speed, and striking power. The treaty did not prevent Japan from building formidable warships. It forced her to get creative. By the early 1930s, aviation had begun to transform what every naval planner thought they knew about sea warfare. The battleship, that cathedral of steel, the supreme expression of a nation's industrial and military ambition, was showing its age. Not on paper, not in war games, but in the imaginations of the men who would fight the next conflict. Aircraft could strike targets dozens of miles away. A carrier's airgroup could project power far beyond the horizon. The Japanese Navy was not slow to recognize this shift. It had been experimenting with carrier aviation since the early 20s and had developed a culture of elite naval aviators who trained relentlessly, who were selected from thousands, and who came to embody a very specific Japanese military ideal skill pushed past the point of human endurance until it became instinct. These men would eventually fly from the decks of the two greatest carriers Japan ever built. The carriers Japan produced under treaty constraints were formidable, but limited. The Hosho, the Ryujo, the Soryu, the Hiryu each represented a step forward, each incorporated hard lessons from the one before, but they all bore the marks of compromise. The Washington and London treaties imposed a ceiling that Japan's designers kept brushing against, forced to trade off armor for speed or range for aircraft capacity. Then, in January of 1937, Japan formally notified the other powers of its intention not to renew the naval limitation treaties. For a few men in a very specific bureau of the Imperial Japanese Navy's technical department, this moment had a particular meaning. The ceiling had been removed. They could now build what they had always wanted to build, not a constrained carrier, not a compromise, but the best fleet carrier that Japanese engineering, Japanese metallurgy, and Japanese naval doctrine could produce. The Shōkaku-class was born in that freedom. The design process began in earnest in 1936 and 1937. The new carriers would be an enlargement of the successful Hiryu design, but the enlargement would not be incremental, it would be transformational. The hull was extended, the beam widened, the protection scheme deepened. The designers took everything the Soryu class had taught them and built an entirely new foundation around it. The result would be a ship of roughly 29,800 tons at standard displacement and 32,000 tons, when fully loaded, significantly larger than the British and American carriers of the same era. But raw tonnage was only part of the story. What the designers were really after was a synthesis, a carrier that could carry more aircraft than any prior Japanese design, sail faster than anything that could threaten her, and absorb punishment that would have sent an earlier ship to the bottom. What they created was, by any honest assessment, one of the finest non-armoured fleet carriers ever laid down by any nation in the Second World War. Work began on Shōkaku at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. The name itself, Shōkaku, meaning soaring crane in Japanese, carried an almost poetic resonance for a warship designed to project air power across vast distances. Her sister, Zuikaku Fortunate Crane, was laid down at the Kawasaki dockyard in Kobe. Both names invoked the crane, an animal that in Japanese culture represents longevity, fidelity, and good fortune. There is a certain irony in that symbolism, given what was coming. But in the late 1930s, as the steel frames rose from the slipways and rivets drove home through hull plates of unprecedented thickness, the men building these ships had every reason to believe the names were apt. They were building something built to last. They were building something built to dominate. The construction timeline was aggressive. Japan was not building for peacetime exercises. The Navy needed these ships operational, and it needed them soon. Political tensions with the United States had been building for years. Japan's expansion into China, her growing assertiveness in Southeast Asia, the long simmering contest over resources and influence across the Pacific, all of it pointed to the men in the naval ministry, toward a future that would require every ship Japan could put to sea. The Shōkaku-class was not an academic exercise. It was a wartime asset being built against a wartime clock. The pressure was immense, the pace relentless, and the standards uncompromising. Every department of both shipyards bent toward the same goal. Get them in the water, get them armed, get them ready. There is something quietly remarkable about what was happening simultaneously in Yokosuka and Kobe during those years. Two of the most consequential warships in the history of naval aviation were being assembled, steel plates welded and riveted together, propulsion systems aligned, flight decks planked in wood while across the Pacific. The men who would eventually face them in battle were going about their entirely ordinary lives. The pilots who would one day fly against the aircraft from these decks were, in the late 1930s, still in high school, still in college. Still farming or working in factories or playing baseball on summer afternoons, the world that was coming had not yet arrived. The ships that would help announce its arrival were still just shapes on a dockside. History, as it always does, was assembling itself quietly out of sight. By the summer of 1939, the Shōkaku was ready for launch. The world outside Japan was already fracturing. Germany had annexed Austria, had absorbed Czechoslovakia, was preparing the moves that would, within weeks, ignite the Second World War in Europe. Japan watched from the eastern rim of the world with careful, calculating eyes. And in the waters of Yokosuka harbor, the long grey hull of the Shōkaku slid from the slipway and met the sea for the first time. She was not yet finished outfitting and sea trials lay ahead, but the shape of Japan's naval ambition had taken physical form. Zuikaku followed, launched at Kobe in November of that same year. 2 cranes had taken flight. The Pacific would never be the same again. Chapter 2: Steel and Sky. The engineering of the Shōkaku-class. There is a specific kind of beauty in a warship that has been engineered without compromise. Not the polished beauty of a yacht or the ceremonial grandeur of a peacetime flagship. Something colder, more functional, more honest. The Shōkaku-class carriers possessed that quality. Everything about them, from the curve of the hull at the waterline to the placement of the island superstructure, had been decided through argument, calculation, and hard-won experience. Nothing was there by accident. Nothing was there because it looked good. Everything was there because the men who designed them believed it gave the ships and the empire an edge. Understanding that engineering is not a technical detour. It is the key to understanding why these ships could do what they did. Begin with the hull. At 257.5 meters overall length and 26 meters at the waterline beam, the Shōkaku and Zuikaku were substantially larger than Japan's previous carriers. The flight deck ran approximately 242 meters long and 29 meters wide, a broad, flat expanse of teak-planked wood over steel framing, large enough to operate a full combat air group with room-to-range aircraft for a mass strike launch. The wooden flight deck was a deliberate choice, lighter than armoured steel and therefore friendlier to the ship's top weight and stability. The British, by contrast, were building armoured flight decks into their carriers at roughly the same time, a choice that would prove its value when kamikaze attacks began, but one that came at the cost of carrying far fewer aircraft. The Shōkaku class was built around a different philosophy: volume of aircraft, not armour above decks. Beneath that flight deck were 2 hangars, stacked one atop the other, connected to the flight deck by 3 large aircraft lifts. The upper hangar ran approximately 190 meters in length. The lower hangar, slightly shorter, gave the ship a combined aircraft capacity that was, at the time of commissioning, among the highest of any carrier afloat. The operational air group was set at 72 aircraft, with a further 12 aircraft carried in reserve, giving a total capacity of 84. Compare this to the contemporary British Illustrious-class carriers, which carried roughly 36 aircraft behind their armoured decks, and the scale of Japan's air power advantage in the early war years becomes clear. These were not carriers designed to project a modest, carefully rationed air presence. They were designed to hit hard, hit fast, and overwhelm whatever stood in the path of their aircraft. The propulsion system matched the ambition. 8 Kampon boilers fed steam to 4 sets of Kampon-geared turbines, delivering 160,000 shaft horsepower across 4 shafts, each turning a 3-blade propeller. The result was a maximum speed in excess of 34 knots, faster than most contemporary carriers, faster than many cruisers, and fast enough to outrun the surface threats that might otherwise corner her. Speed was not a luxury on a carrier. Speed was survival. A carrier that could not outrun a cruiser was a liability. A carrier that could dictate the terms of an engagement approaching from an unexpected direction, launching aircraft and withdrawing before the enemy could respond, was something else entirely. The Shōkaku class was built to be that kind of ship. The protection scheme represented one of the most serious attempts yet by Japan to give a fleet carrier genuine survivability. The external belt armour at the waterline ran 46 mm thick, protecting the machinery spaces. The armor deck over the machinery was 90 millimeters thick, 65 millimeters of hardened armor plate on a 25 millimeter backing, while the same protection over the magazines reached 132 millimeters horizontally and 165 millimeters vertically. For a carrier built without treaty constraints, this represented a genuine investment in survivability. It was not battleship armor, it was never intended to be, but it was serious protection against the kind of damage a fleet carrier could realistically be expected to absorb: near-miss bomb explosions, splinter damage, partial flooding from torpedo hits. The designers knew they could not make the ship invincible. They tried to make her survivable. The aviation fuel storage was the ship's most dangerous vulnerability, and it is worth understanding precisely why. Carrier aviation in the 1940s ran on highly volatile avgas aviation gasoline that produced vapor at ordinary temperatures and could, under the right conditions, fill an enclosed space with an explosive mixture of air and fuel. The Shōkaku-class stored approximately 1,800 tons of aviation fuel. The hangars were enclosed, unlike the open-sided American carrier designs of the era, meaning that fuel vapor, which leaked from damaged aircraft or ruptured fuel lines, had nowhere to go except into the body of the ship. American carriers, with their open hangars, could vent fumes naturally. British carriers could rely on their armored decks to contain explosions within the hangar. The Shōkaku-class had neither advantage. What the enclosed hangar gave in aircraft capacity and weather protection, it took back in fire risk. This design tension between the capability of the closed hangar and the danger of accumulated vapor would eventually matter enormously. The island structure, that small superstructure placed on the starboard side of the flight deck, which housed the bridge, the navigation facilities, and the command spaces, had been the subject of considerable internal debate during the design process. Earlier, Japanese carriers had experimented with portside islands, or no island at all. The Shōkaku's designers initially considered placing the bridge structure on the port side to minimize turbulence over the flight deck and maximize takeoff space. After extended analysis, the decision was made to position the island on the starboard side and further forward, in line with conventional practice. The flight deck was then extended slightly to port to compensate for the asymmetry of the island's weight. It was the kind of engineering compromise that sounds minor in a history book, but represented months of calculation and argument in the design bureau. The defensive armament was powerful in theory and limited in practice, a combination that would haunt the Japanese Navy throughout the war. 16 127mm Type 89 dual-purpose guns in 8 twin mounts, 2 per side forward and 2 per side aft, provided the primary anti-aircraft battery. 12 triple 25mm Type 96 light anti-aircraft mounts were arranged along the sides. The 25mm weapons were, by the standards of the time, neither sufficiently numerous nor sufficiently effective. Their rate of fire was moderate, their fire control systems were outdated, and the effective engagement envelope against fast-diving aircraft was limited. This was a flaw that the Japanese Navy recognized, but never fully corrected across the war, the result partly of industrial constraints and partly of a doctrinal culture that prioritized offensive aviation over defensive gunnery. The original airgroup, as delivered in 1941, consisted of 18 Mitsubishi A, 6M Type 0 fighters, 27 Aichi-D, 3A Type 99 dive bombers, and 27 Nakajima B, 5N Type 97 carrier attack aircraft. The Zero fighter needs little introduction to anyone familiar with the Pacific War. Fast, extraordinarily maneuverable, and possessed of a combat range that shocked American pilots who encountered it. The D-3A dive bomber, known to the Allies as VAL, was slower and less glamorous, but was, in 1941 and 1942, one of the most accurate dive-bombing platforms in any Navy's inventory. The B-5N torpedo bomber, known as Kate, was the weapon that would strike the most consequential blows in the opening phases of the war. Together, these 3 aircraft types represented the most capable and balanced carrier air wing in the world at the moment the Shōkaku-class entered service. The funnels represented one of the more distinctive visual features of the design. Rather than routing exhaust gases upward through the island in the manner of American and British carriers, the Shōkaku class continued the Japanese practice of projecting the funnels sideways out of the hull, below the level of the flight deck. This kept the flight deck free of stack gases and turbulence, at the cost of a somewhat ungainly visual appearance. It also placed hot gases close to the hull plating in a way that required careful management, particularly during extended high-speed operations. But the flight deck, in Japanese naval doctrine, was sacred space. Every meter of unobstructed deck was a meter available to aircraft operations. The engineers accommodated the funnels where they could without compromising that principle. By the time Shōkaku and Zuikaku were commissioned and ready for war, they represented the most complete expression of Japanese carrier doctrine that had ever existed. They were not perfect ships. No ship ever built has been perfect. But they were extraordinary ones. Chapter 3. The 5th Division, Commissioning and the Road to Pearl Harbor. The Shōkaku was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on the 8th of August, 1941. The world into which she was born was already burning at its edges. Germany and the Soviet Union had been locked in war since June of that year. Britain was fighting alone in Europe. The United States, officially neutral, was providing material support to Britain and had frozen Japanese assets in response to Japan's occupation of southern French Indochina. The oil embargo that followed the United States, supplying roughly 80% of Japan's petroleum needs, was not merely an economic inconvenience. It was an existential threat to a navy that ran on fuel oil and an air force that ran on avgas. The Shōkaku entered service into a Japan that had, in the minds of its military leadership, been backed into a corner from which only one direction of movement was possible. Zuikaku followed her sister into commission on the 25th of September. Together, the two new carriers were assigned to form the 5th Carrier Division of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, replacing the older carriers Hosho and Ryojo. The 5th Carrier Division would become part of the Kidō Butai, the striking force, the massed carrier group that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was assembling as the instrument of his most audacious strategic gamble. The Kidō Butai, as assembled for the Pearl Harbor operation, was an unprecedented concentration of carrier air power. 6 fleet carriers, with their escort vessels, their supporting cruisers and destroyers and battleships, sailing together as a single striking unit. Nothing like it had ever been assembled before. Nothing like it would be assembled again, not by Japan, not by any navy, until the Americans matched and exceeded it in the middle years of the war. The 5th Carrier Division was, by virtue of being the newest and least combat experienced of the 3 carrier divisions in the Kidō Butai, assigned the role of close support and protective fighter coverage rather than the primary strike wave at Pearl Harbor. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kidō Butai from his flagship Akagi. The 5th Division flew under Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, one of the most aggressive and tactically creative officers in the Japanese carrier fleet, a man who would later demonstrate, in the crucible of battle, an operational boldness that stood apart even in a force not short of boldness. For Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the Pearl Harbor operation was the first time they would work together as a combat unit, the first time their air groups would launch and recover in anger, the first test of everything the engineers and the trainers had built. The training that preceded Pearl Harbor was intense and relentless. The air groups of all 6 carriers had spent months rehearsing the attack, practicing torpedo runs in the shallow water conditions of Kagoshima Bay, which bore a rough topographical resemblance to Pearl Harbor's restricted anchorage, developing new wooden-finned torpedo designs that could run in water less than 15 meters deep without burying themselves in the harbor floor. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku were newcomers to this world. Their air groups, though equipped with superb aircraft and trained pilots, had not yet flown from their new carriers in large-scale coordinated exercises. The 5th Division had less time to practice together than the 1st and 2nd Divisions Nagumo's veteran carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been working together for months. What the 5th Division's air groups lacked in collective experience, they made up for in individual skill. These were among the most able naval aviators Japan possessed. The Kidō Butai departed the Kurile Islands in late November of 1941, sailing northeast and then east across the North Pacific on a course designed to avoid commercial shipping lanes. Strict radio silence was maintained. No unnecessary transmissions, no lights at night. The escort destroyers formed a protective screen. The tankers sailed alongside to allow refueling at sea itself, a remarkable logistical achievement, as mid-ocean refueling under winter North Pacific conditions was an operation of considerable skill and danger. 6 carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 8 tankers moved east across an ocean that did not yet know they were coming. Inside the carriers, the atmosphere was one of focused, disciplined tension. Final briefings were conducted, maps were studied, questions were asked and answered. And then there was nothing left to do but wait and sail. On the 7th of December, 1941, the 8th of December, west of the international dateline, the Kidō Butai reached its launch position roughly 400 kilometers north of Oahu, Hawaii. The first wave launched in darkness and low cloud. The aircraft from Shōkaku and Zuikaku participated in the attack, providing fighter cover and supporting strike elements for both waves. Their Zeros strafed airfields. Their Kate torpedo bombers and Val dive bombers joined the storm that fell on the American fleet at anchor. The results are among the most documented events in all of military history. 4 battleships sunk, 4 more damaged, numerous smaller vessels lost or damaged, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. The United States had entered the war, pulled in not by choice but by the weight of the blow that had just been delivered. The 5th Carrier Division's role at Pearl Harbor was real and direct, though it operated alongside the more senior 1st and 2nd Divisions rather than leading them. What the Shōkaku and Zuikaku took away from that morning was something more important than any specific battle honor: operational experience. They had launched and recovered aircraft under combat conditions. Their damage control parties had stood their stations, their communication systems had functioned, their machinery had performed. The months of construction and fitting out and sea trials had produced ships that worked as designed. The Kidō Butai turned for home, and in the wardrooms of the 5th Division's 2 carriers, officers who had been cautious about their ship's untested readiness now knew something essential. These were extraordinary ships, and the men who sailed and flew from them were exceptional. The question now was what came next. The answer was everything. On the return voyage, the 5th Carrier Division was assigned to screen the main fleet against American submarines believed to be following the strike force. It was unglamorous work, the strategic moment had passed, and the 5th Division was now playing a defensive role while the fleet returned to Japanese home waters. But even in this subordinate task, there was value. The 2 carriers were learning to work together, their captains and airgroup commanders developing the communication rhythms and tactical instincts that would sustain them through years of hard campaigning. Shōkaku and Zuikaku arrived back in Japan to a nation that celebrated what it had achieved without fully reckoning with what it had initiated. The attack on Pearl Harbor had not broken American power, it had focused it. The carriers the attack had failed to catch absent from Pearl Harbor that morning on a routine mission were alive, operational, and already being turned toward war. The most dangerous enemy the Shōkaku and Zuikaku would ever face had not yet shown its full strength. In January and February of 1942, the 5th Carrier Division participated in operations against Rabaul in the southwestern Pacific raids designed to suppress Allied air power, clear the way for Japanese amphibious landings, and extend the defensive perimeter of the newly proclaimed Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. These operations were successful but relatively low risk. The opposition was thin, the targets were lightly defended, and the carriers operated against land-based aircraft rather than enemy carrier groups. For Shōkaku and Zuikaku, these months were a deepening apprenticeship in carrier warfare, a chance to refine procedures, test their air groups under fire, and prepare for the harder test that was coming. The men on those decks were becoming, engagement by engagement, a genuine fighting unit. Something formidable was being forged in those months, out of repetition and risk and the particular chemistry of men who trust each other under fire. March and April of 1942 brought the Indian Ocean Raid, an operation that, in scope and daring, has never received the attention it deserves in Western histories of the war. Admiral Nagumo led the Kidō Butai into the Indian Ocean to strike British naval bases at Colombo and Trincomalee on Ceylon, and to hunt British naval forces in those waters. The raid achieved significant results. A British carrier, HMS Hermes, was among the vessels lost, along with cruisers and other warships. Allied land-based aircraft losses were severe. For a brief, terrifying moment, the Indian Ocean itself seemed to be falling under Japanese air domination, a prospect that would have reshaped not just the naval balance but the entire logistical and political architecture of the Allied war effort in Asia. Shōkaku and Zuikaku sailed through these operations unscathed, their air groups performing with the efficiency and precision that months of practice had built. The Japanese carrier force had reached the high tide of its power. What came next would begin to test whether that power could be sustained. The mood in Japan's naval command in the spring of 1942 was one of complicated confidence. The early successes had been real, the victories sweeping. But Yamamoto and others understood that time was not Japan's ally. The Americans were building, training, and burning with a very specific kind of anger. The strategic window, the period during which Japan could choose its battles, concentrate its forces, and fight on terms favorable to its training and equipment, was not unlimited. Decisions made in the coming months would either extend that window or close it. And the first truly consequential test of what the 5th Carrier Division could do when it faced an enemy that was ready, fighting back, and increasingly capable was already approaching. It had a name: the Coral Sea. Chapter 4, Coral Sea, the First True Test. The Battle of the Coral Sea, fought in early May of 1942, holds a particular place in the history of the Pacific War and a peculiar place in the history of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku specifically. It was the first carrier battle in the history of naval warfare in which the opposing surface fleets never came within sight of each other. No gun was fired between surface ships. No torpedo was launched from a destroyer at an enemy vessel. The entire battle was fought by aircraft operating beyond visual range of their home ships, a new kind of war, fought in a new dimension by men who trusted maps and radio and gut instinct rather than their own eyes. And for the 5th Carrier Division, it was the moment the world found out what these ships could do, both in terms of their capacity to deliver destruction and their capacity to absorb it. The strategic context matters enormously here. By May of 1942, Japan was attempting to consolidate and extend its defensive perimeter in the southwestern Pacific. The key objective was the capture of Port Moresby on the southern coast of New Guinea, which would give Japan a base from which to threaten northern Australia and interdict Allied supply lines. The 5th Carrier Division Shōkaku and Zuikaku was assigned to the invasion force as carrier air cover, providing the air power that would suppress Allied interference with the Port Moresby landing. Also included in the Japanese force was the light carrier Shōho, a smaller vessel providing supplementary air support to the landing fleet. Opposing them were 2 American carriers, the Lexington and the Yorktown, under the overall command of Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. American naval intelligence had, with remarkable accuracy, anticipated the Japanese plan. The carriers were already moving to intercept. The opening days of the battle saw both sides feeling for each other across the difficult geography of the Coral Sea, a body of water stippled with islands and reefs, prone to sudden weather changes, its skies alternating between glaring tropical clarity and thick, disorienting cloud cover. On the 7th of May, the 2 sides found each other's light elements. Japanese aircraft located the American oiler Neosho, and her escorting destroyer Sims mistook them for larger warships and expended a significant portion of that day's strike capacity on targets that were, strategically, irrelevant. American aircraft found the Shōho, the small Japanese carrier, assigned to the invasion force's direct support, and sank her. The first Japanese carrier lost in the war went to the bottom of the Coral Sea that morning. But the 2 heavyweights, Shōkaku and Zuikaku, Lexington and Yorktown, had not yet found each other. The main event was still coming. The 8th of May, 1942, is one of the most consequential days in Pacific War history. Before dawn, both carrier forces launched search aircraft to locate their opponents. Contact was made within hours. The Japanese launched their strike-first aircraft from both the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, heading southeast toward the American carriers. The Americans launched theirs shortly after, heading northwest toward the Japanese. The two strike formations passed each other somewhere over the Coral Sea, invisible to one another, each racing toward the other's home ships. It was a moment that would have seemed almost abstract, two streams of aircraft, crossing in an empty sky, if not for the devastation each was carrying. The geography of weather played a decisive and deeply unfair role in what followed. The Zuikaku was sailing under a thick front of low cloud and rain squalls. Her position was effectively hidden from the American attack. The Shōkaku, by contrast, was operating in clear sky. She had no such protection. Yorktown's aircraft found her first, and a pattern of bomb hits struck her flight deck, putting it out of commission and setting fires below decks. A subsequent attack by part of Lexington's air group added further damage. Shōkaku was hit badly enough that she could no longer conduct flight operations. She was ordered to retire from the action and make for Japan. Against the American carriers, the Japanese strike force, including aircraft from the Zuikaku, found the Lexington and Yorktown operating in clear sky. The Lexington was struck by both torpedoes and bombs. The Yorktown was hit by a bomb. The damage to Yorktown was serious but manageable. The Lexington, initially appearing to have survived, suffered a catastrophic secondary explosion from accumulated aviation fuel vapor in her hull several hours after the attack, and had to be abandoned and scuttled by her own crew. On the raw tactical ledger, Japan could claim a victory. An American fleet carrier sunk, another damaged, losses in aircraft and pilots absorbed on both sides. But the strategic accounting told a different story. The Port Moresby invasion force, robbed of effective carrier air cover, turned back. Port Moresby remained in Allied hands. And the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the two most powerful carriers in the Japanese Navy, the spine of the Kidō Butai, were both, in different ways, out of the fight for what proved to be a critical span of time. Shōkaku had to be taken in for extensive repairs. Zuikaku's air group had been devastated in the fighting. The pilots and aircrew who had been lost over the Coral Sea could not be replaced quickly. This last point deserves particular emphasis because its consequences were enormous. The Japanese system for training carrier aviators was, in 1942, producing excellent pilots in relatively small numbers. The selection process was rigorous, the training lengthy, and the output could not be scaled rapidly. When experienced pilots were lost in battle, the Japanese Navy could not simply draft replacements from a large pool of partially trained men and call them combat-ready. The losses at Coral Sea added to the losses accumulated in the months of intense operations since Pearl Harbor had eaten into a resource that was, functionally, irreplaceable on any short timeline. Zuikaku's air group had been shot to pieces. The carrier herself was physically intact, but without her trained air group, she was not combat capable. Not for the next battle. Not for the battle that was coming. The decision not to reconstitute the depleted air groups of the 5th Carrier Division in time for the Battle of Midway has been argued over by historians for decades. The Zuikaku was undamaged as a ship. A case existed and several Japanese officers made it at the time that the surviving aircraft from both the Shōkaku and Zuikaku could have been combined onto the Zuikaku's deck to form a functional, if reduced, air group in time to join the Midway operation. The decision was not made. Whether from overconfidence, from a belief that 4 carriers were sufficient, from the operational complexity of cross-decking air groups under a tight preparation schedule, or from some combination of all three, the 5th Division stayed home. Both the damaged Shōkaku and the aircraft-depleted Zuikaku missed Midway. The 4 carriers that sailed Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu did not return. The most consequential carrier battle of the Pacific War was fought without Japan's 2 finest ships. And Japan lost it. The Battle of Midway is not this story's central focus, but its shadow fell across everything that followed. In 4 days of fighting at the beginning of June 1942, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, their experienced air groups, and hundreds of irreplaceable trained aviators. The industrial and strategic balance of the Pacific War shifted in those 4 days in a way that all the subsequent brilliant Japanese tactical performances could not reverse. The Kidō Butai, as it had existed, the concentrated strike force that had terrorized Allied navies from Pearl Harbor to Ceylon, was gone. What remained of Japan's carrier fleet after Midway was built around one ship. That ship was the Zuikaku, undamaged, experienced, and now suddenly carrying a weight of strategic responsibility that no single carrier could reasonably bear. In the repair yards of Japan, the Shōkaku underwent the work needed to restore her to fighting condition. The bomb damage from the Coral Sea was severe. Her flight deck had been put completely out of action, internal fires had caused significant structural damage, and the repair work required months of intensive effort. While the workers labored over the Shōkaku's wounds and the Zuikaku's air group was rebuilt with replacement pilots who were, on average, less experienced than the men, they replaced the war was moving on without them. Guadalcanal was turning into a grinding campaign of attrition that would consume Japanese air power in ways that the strategists of early 1942 had not anticipated. The 2 finest carriers in the Japanese Navy were sitting in port while the Empire fought for its strategic life in the waters around a jungle island. The clock was running, the 5th Division was needed, and it was almost ready. Chapter 5, Guadalcanal, the grinding return. Guadalcanal. The name itself became, in the second half of 1942, a kind of shorthand for the particular horror of a campaign that neither side expected, that both sides poured men and ships and aircraft into far beyond the point of rational calculation, and that neither could afford to lose. When American Marines landed on the island on the 7th of August, 1942, the Japanese response was swift and aggressive. The airfield being constructed there, which would become Henderson Field, the fulcrum around which the entire campaign turned, could not be allowed to become operational in American hands. Japanese warships ran men and supplies down the passage between islands that American sailors came to call the Slot in nightly runs that became legendary for their audacity and their cost. And as the ground campaign hardened into something terrible and intractable, both navies committed their carrier forces to the waters north of the island in a series of battles that would, engagement by engagement, drain the strength of Japan's carrier aviation beyond any hope of recovery. The 5th Carrier Division was back. Shōkaku had been repaired. Zuikaku's air group had been rebuilt, at least partially, with replacement pilots from the training pipeline. In August of 1942, the 2 carriers sailed into the waters northeast of Guadalcanal as part of a Japanese carrier force responding to the American landings. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons on the 24th and 25th of August brought them into action again, the second carrier battle of the Pacific War, fought in the same general geography as Coral Sea but with different ships and different stakes. The American carriers Enterprise and Saratoga opposed the Japanese force. The light carrier Ryojo was lost on the Japanese side. The Enterprise was damaged. Shōkaku herself participated in operations that contributed to the damage inflicted on the Enterprise, though she helped damage rather than sink her. It was not a decisive result for either side. But it was another battle, another exchange of aircraft and pilots, another draft on a Japanese aviation account that was running increasingly short of reserves. Between the major carrier engagements, the Guadalcanal campaign consumed Japanese naval air power in a different and perhaps more damaging way through the constant, grinding attrition of land-based air operations conducted from airfields in the region, and through the aircraft losses incurred in the nightly naval battles and resupply runs. The carrier aircraft on the Shōkaku and Zuikaku were not the only Japanese aircraft being lost. Land-based bombers and fighters from bases in the Solomons and at Rabaul were flying mission after mission, suffering losses that could not be replaced from a training system already under strain. The cumulative effect of months of intensive operations, Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, the Indian Ocean, and now Guadalcanal, was not yet visible in any single dramatic defeat. It was visible in the quality of the replacement pilots who were arriving at the carrier air groups. They were less experienced, they had fewer hours, they made more mistakes. And in carrier aviation, mistakes had a way of being permanent. October of 1942 brought the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, the fourth carrier duel of the Pacific War, and arguably the most costly for both sides in terms of material and human losses. The Japanese carrier force assembled for this engagement included the Shōkaku, Zuikaku, and two light carriers, facing two American carriers, the Enterprise and the Hornet. The stakes, once again, were Guadalcanal. Japan needed to neutralize American carrier air power in order to land reinforcements and supply the army units on the island fighting to retake Henderson Field. America needed to preserve its carrier strength to maintain air superiority over Guadalcanal and keep the supply line to the Marine garrison alive. Neither side could afford to lose. Both sides knew it. The battle was fought on the 26th of October, 1942. Once again, both sides launched strikes that found each other's carriers in rapid succession. The American Hornet was hit severely torpedoes and bombs and could not be saved. The Enterprise, badly damaged, managed to survive and withdraw. But the Japanese paid heavily for this tactical victory. The Shōkaku was struck by multiple bomb hits, sustaining severe damage to her flight deck that once again put her out of action. Aircraft and pilot losses on the Japanese side were severe. The American Hornet was gone, and the Enterprise was crippled, but Japan had traded its precious trained aviators for those results in proportions it could not sustain. One American carrier destroyed and one temporarily neutralized at the cost of the Shōkaku, damaged once more, and a further brutal reduction in the pool of experienced Japanese carrier pilots who, unlike ships, could not be built in a shipyard. The Shōkaku's second major battle damage in less than a year is worth pausing on. This was a pattern that told a story about both the ship and the enemy she faced. The Shōkaku was not a fragile vessel. She had been built to survive punishment, and she had survived it twice now. The bomb hits at Santa Cruz that wrecked her flight deck and forced her retreat to Japan for repairs would have sent a lesser-built carrier to the bottom. The fact that she came back twice from serious damage was a testament to the quality of her construction and to the extraordinary efforts of her damage control crews. But the pattern also told another story. She kept getting hit. The American aviators who found her in the Coral Sea and at Santa Cruz were improving, their tactics were refining. Their determination was not weakening. Each time Shōkaku survived a mauling and returned to port for repairs, she came back to a war that was on the widest strategic scale, slowly but unmistakably moving against Japan. Zuikaku, meanwhile, continued the pattern she had established at the Coral Sea present in the engagement, contributing to the battle's outcome, but escaping the worst of the damage. Whether this was a consequence of superior seamanship, better fortune in terms of weather cover, tactical positioning, or some combination of the three, the Zuikaku earned a reputation during the Guadalcanal campaign as a ship that could fight hard and emerge intact. This was not simply luck, though. Luck played its role. The Zuikaku's captains and airgroup commanders throughout this period were operating the ship with skill and aggression. But the contrast with the Shōkaku was real. One sister seemed to draw the worst of every battle's fury. The other seemed to slip through. History, which is built as much from individual fortune as from collective strategy, was still undecided about what it intended for both of them. By November of 1942, the naval battles around Guadalcanal had become so intense, so costly, and so strategically disruptive that both navies were operating in a state of near exhaustion. The Americans lost cruisers and destroyers in night actions that became almost weekly events. The Japanese lost destroyers, cruisers, and irreplaceable men in the same grinding attrition. The carrier forces, both Japanese and American, were too damaged, too depleted, or too precious to risk in another full carrier engagement in the immediate term. They withdrew to safer waters to repair, resupply, and rebuild. The Shōkaku went back to the yards again. The Zuikaku, once more, survived to fight another day. Guadalcanal would eventually be evacuated by Japan in February of 1943, a strategic defeat wrapped in the careful language of redeployment, and with it, the phase of the war in which the 5th Carrier Division had been the most important instrument of Japanese naval power drew to a close. A new phase was coming. It would be the last one. The months between the end of the Guadalcanal campaign and the next great carrier engagement gave the Japanese Navy time to repair its ships and train replacement aviators, but not enough time to genuinely replace what had been lost. The experienced carrier aviators who had attacked Pearl Harbor, who had swept through the Indian Ocean, who had fought at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, the men who had built their skills over years of intensive training and actual combat were gone, or nearly gone. Those who remained carried a weight of institutional knowledge that could not be transferred quickly enough to the thousands of new pilots entering the training pipeline. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku, repaired and rearmed, sailed into 1944 as magnificent machines, crewed by men who were, on average, less capable than the crews who had sailed them into their first battles. The ships had not changed. The world around them had. Chapter 6. The Marianas, Where Eagles Fell. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific War had been transformed beyond recognition from the conflict that had begun at Pearl Harbor less than 3 years earlier. The Americans were no longer fighting a defensive holding action. They were driving west and north through the Pacific, island by island, base by base, building an infrastructure of airfields and supply depots and anchorages that was, in scale and efficiency, an industrial achievement unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. The Japanese perimeter was contracting. The outer defensive ring had been broken. And now the Americans were moving on the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, which sat close enough to the Japanese home islands to serve as bases for a new generation of American long-range bombers. The loss of the Marianas was not an acceptable strategic outcome for Japan. It was, in the minds of the Naval Command, the line that had to be held. The Japanese plan for the defense of the Marianas was called Operation Eigo. It was, at its core, a gamble, a bet, that a decisive carrier engagement could be forced in waters close enough to Japanese land-based airfields that those aircraft could supplement the carrier air groups, giving Japan a combined air strength sufficient to overwhelm the American carrier task forces and break the Marianas' invasion. The plan was not without logic. The American supply lines were long, their carriers were operating far from their own bases, and a genuine naval defeat in these waters would have imposed massive costs on the invasion schedule. But the plan depended on two things that proved not to be true: that Japanese land-based aircraft would be able to participate effectively in the battle, and that the quality and number of Japanese carrier aviators had been restored to something approaching their 1941 levels. Neither was the case. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku sailed into the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 as the two most experienced surviving carriers in the Japanese fleet. Around them was the rest of Japan's carrier strength, a force that, on paper, looked formidable, 9 carriers in total, carrying roughly 450 aircraft. The American carrier force they were moving to engage was Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, 15 carriers, nearly 900 aircraft, and a supporting surface force of extraordinary power. The numbers were not entirely lopsided, but the qualitative gap, the difference between the average American carrier pilot in June of 1944 and the average Japanese carrier pilot of the same date, was enormous. The Americans had been training for 3 years in a system that had scaled rapidly after Pearl Harbor, feeding thousands of pilots through a curriculum that was rigorous, realistic, and continuously improved by combat experience. The Japanese had been fighting and losing experienced pilots faster than they could be replaced. The battle began on the 19th of June, 1944. The Japanese launched 4 waves of aircraft from their carriers, a total of several hundred planes, the largest carrier-launched airstrike the Japanese Navy had ever assembled. The strikes were detected early by American radar. Fighter director officers on the American carriers coordinated their combat air patrols with a precision born of hard experience. The Hellcat fighters scrambling to meet the incoming Japanese waves were faster, better protected, and flown by men who were, aircraft for aircraft, significantly more capable than many of their opponents. What followed became known, with the grim informality that combat veterans use for terrible things, as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese lost aircraft in numbers that were not tactical losses, they were existential ones. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down that day. The carrier aviation that had struck Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for the first 6 months of the war, was being consumed in the skies above the Philippine Sea at a rate that left no possibility of recovery. While this disaster unfolded in the air above the battle, something equally fatal was happening beneath the surface of the sea. The American submarine USS Cavallo had been tracking the Shōkaku for some time and had maneuvered into attack position. Just past midday on the 19th of June, the Cavallo fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the carrier. 3 found their mark on her starboard side. Shōkaku came to a dead stop. Her damage control crews, the same men who had saved her at Coral Sea, who had brought her home from the Santa Cruz Islands, who had developed an almost personal relationship with the art of keeping her alive, went to work. They fought for over an hour to control the flooding, to isolate the damaged spaces, to keep the ship from going under. They had saved her before. Against the bomb damage of 2 previous battles, their skills and their courage had been sufficient. This time, they were not. The torpedoes, the American Mark 14 torpedo, which had spent the early years of the war plagued by a defective exploder mechanism, but which had been repaired and was by mid-1944 functioning as designed, struck with a violence that the Shōkaku's structure could not fully absorb. And the aviation fuel, the enormous stores of volatile avgas, the fuel for the aircraft that were no longer flying because they had been shot from the sky. It had been pooling and vaporizing in the enclosed hangars and fuel spaces as damage accumulated. The damage control efforts were gallant, prolonged, and ultimately insufficient. A catastrophic explosion of accumulated aviation fuel vapor tore through the ship. The Shōkaku rolled over and sank approximately 140 miles north of the island of Yap. 1,263 men went with her, her crew, and the men of the air group who had stayed aboard. 570 survivors were recovered from the sea by her escorting destroyers. The Shōkaku was gone, the ship that had survived the Coral Sea, the ship that had come back from Santa Cruz, the ship that had been hit so many times and repaired so many times that her damage control crews had become legendary for their skill and their stubbornness. She was gone, in the space of an afternoon, on the 19th of June, 1944. The Cavallo, the submarine that sank her, barely survived the depth charge counterattack from the escorting destroyer Urikaze, but made it through with minor damage. The sea that had been Shōkaku's home for less than 3 years closed over her. The soaring crane had come to rest at the bottom of the Pacific, in water too deep for anyone to reach. Zuikaku lived through that day. She launched her aircraft into the same skies where most of them were destroyed. She received no submarine attack, no fatal bomb hit, no catastrophic internal explosion. She was still afloat when the sun set on the 19th of June. She was still the last surviving carrier of the 6 that had attacked Pearl Harbor, a distinction that was becoming, with every passing month, more historical than tactical, because the fleet she had once led no longer existed in any meaningful sense. The carrier aviation Japan had built over 2 decades of investment and effort, had refined through years of intense training, had wielded with such devastatingly effective results in the opening phase of the war, it was not merely damaged after the Philippine Sea, it was finished. The aircraft were gone, the pilots were gone. Remained was the hull of the Zuikaku, beautiful, intact, and functionally hollow. A carrier without an air group was not a weapon. It was a monument, and the war had no use for monuments. The Battle of the Philippine Sea ended in strategic catastrophe for Japan. The invasion of Saipan proceeded, the Marianas fell. And with the Marianas in American hands, the long-range bombers that Japanese strategists had most feared, the Boeing B-29 superfortresses of the United States Army Air Forces would, within months, begin the systematic destruction of Japanese cities from bases close enough to reach the home islands. The loss of the Shōkaku was one loss among many that day, but it was, in the specific history of Japan's carrier fleet, the loss that cut deepest. She had been the heart of the 5th Carrier Division since August of 1941. She had fought in every major carrier engagement of the Pacific War. She had been hit, repaired, and returned to battle more times than any comparable ship on either side. She had been extraordinary, and she was gone. Zuikaku returned to Japan after the Philippine Sea, carrying the weight of everything that had been lost, not metaphorically but operationally. She was now the senior carrier in the Japanese fleet, the most experienced, the most storied, and the most alone. The men who had sailed with her from the Kuril Islands in November of 1941, who had looked down on the smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, who had fought at the Coral Sea and at Santa Cruz, were fewer now. Some had been killed, some had been rotated to shore assignments, some were still aboard, carrying 3 years of war in their faces and their posture. They knew, in the way that fighting men always know before the official orders confirm it, that the next engagement would be different from anything that had come before. It would not be an operation of strategic ambition. It would be something else, something harder to name and harder to accept. It would be the last operation. They were right. Chapter 7. Ghosts of Midway. What the absence cost. There are moments in history that are defined not by what happened, but by what did not. The Battle of Midway, fought across the 4th, 5th and 6th of June, 1942, is one of the most examined naval engagements in the entire history of warfare. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk, 4 American fleet carriers reduced to 2 by the end of the battle, with the Yorktown lost shortly after. The transformation of the Pacific War's strategic direction in the space of 4 days, the books written about Midway fill entire library shelves. The arguments about its turning point status fill academic journals. But buried inside every analysis of Midway, often treated as a footnote, occasionally treated as the most important counterfactual of the entire Pacific War, is the absence of 2 ships. The Shōkaku and the Zuikaku were not at Midway, and the question of what would have been different if they had been there is not merely an idle speculation for enthusiasts. It is a window into the deepest vulnerabilities of the strategic choices Japan made in the spring of 1942. To understand why this absence mattered so profoundly, you have to understand the arithmetic of carrier air power in 1942. A carrier battle was not, in the most fundamental sense, a battle between ships. It was a battle between air groups, between the trained, experienced, cohesive fighting units of pilots and aircrew who had learned to operate together, who understood each other's instincts, who could execute complex coordinated attacks under fire with the precision that only hundreds of hours of shared practice could produce. The aircraft themselves were machinery. The trained men who flew them were something that could not be manufactured quickly. Japan understood this as well as any navy in the world. And yet, in the weeks between the Coral Sea and Midway, Japan made a choice, or rather, failed to make a choice that left 2 of its finest carriers sitting in home waters, while the decisive battle of the Pacific War was fought without them. The Shōkaku's damage from the Coral Sea was genuine and severe. Bomb hits had destroyed her flight deck, caused fires below decks, and required months of repair work at the Kure Naval Arsenal to fully address. She could not have sailed to Midway regardless of any decision made in Tokyo or at Combined Fleet headquarters. That absence was forced. But Zuikaku's absence was a decision, and it is the decision that history has never quite finished arguing about. The Zuikaku herself was undamaged as a ship. Her hull, her engines, her machinery were all in perfect working order after the Coral Sea. What the battle had taken from her was not steel or rivets. It was people. Her air group had been devastated in the fighting over the Coral Sea, with experienced pilots and aircrew lost in proportions that left her unable to operate as a full combat-capable carrier air group without a period of rest and reconstitution. Several officers within the Japanese naval planning structure raised the possibility of solving this problem in the simplest possible way. Take the surviving aircraft and aviators from both the Shōkaku and Zuikaku's depleted air groups, combine them onto the Zuikaku's deck, and send her to Midway. The mathematics of this solution were uncomfortable but not impossible. The combined survivors of both air groups could have assembled something approximating a functional, if reduced, strike capability. Zuikaku's deck was large enough, her machinery capable enough, and the time before the Midway operation, though tight, was arguably sufficient for the kind of rapid cross-decking and minimal collective training that such a scheme would have required. This was not a fantasy option. It was discussed. It was rejected. The reasons given centered on the inadequacy of the available trained replacement pilots and the compressed preparation timeline, but the decision has been questioned ever since by historians who note that Japan sailed 4 carriers to Midway, believing 4 was sufficient. The 4 carriers that did sail Akagi, Kaga, Soru, and Hiryu were not inferior ships. The 1st and 2nd carrier divisions were the most experienced carrier units in the world at the time of Midway. Their air groups were veteran formations. Their commanders were able men, but they sailed into a battle where the Americans, having broken the Japanese naval cipher, knew they were coming, knew their composition, knew their approximate timing, and had arranged their own carriers to intercept from a position of intelligence advantage that the Japanese commanders did not know they had ceded. The result was the loss of 3 Japanese carriers in a matter of minutes on the morning of the 5th of June, with the 4th Hiryu fighting brilliantly before being mortally damaged that afternoon. 4 Japanese fleet carriers gone in a single day of fighting. The Kidō Butai, as a strategic instrument, as the concentrated carrier force that had made Japan's opening campaign possible, ceased to exist. Now, perform the arithmetic of the counterfactual. Add the Zuikaku to the Japanese order of battle at Midway, even with a reduced air group, even carrying fewer aircraft than her full complement. Add her to the 4 carriers that sailed, and you have a 5th flight deck, a 5th launch point, a 5th recovery platform, and an additional increment of air group strength that might have changed the timing of strikes, the weight of attacks, and the scale of combat air patrol available to protect the Japanese fleet. Would it have changed the outcome? No one can say with certainty. The Americans had advantages at Midway beyond their carriers, the intelligence picture, the geography of the engagement, the performance of certain American dive bomber units at the critical moment of the battle that were not all attributable to the simple numerical balance of carrier air groups. But 5 carriers are harder to destroy in a single engagement than 4. A 5th flight deck might have absorbed the American attacks differently, might have kept at least 1 more Japanese carrier operational, might have altered the exchange ratio of the battle in ways that changed not just the day but the weeks and months that followed. What actually followed Midway, in the absence of the 5th Carrier Division, was a period of Japanese naval operations in which the consequences of the carrier losses were masked by the sheer pace of events and the resilience of Japanese land-based air power. The occupation of Guadalcanal and its airfield by American Marines in August of 1942 came as a shock to Japanese planners who had not anticipated American offensive action so soon. The response was immediate and improvised night naval runs to supply and reinforce the island garrison, airstrikes from Rabaul against Henderson Field, and eventually the commitment of carrier forces to the waters north of Guadalcanal. But the carrier forces committed were not the same quality as the Kidō Butai that had opened the war. The veterans of the 1st and 2nd Carrier Divisions were gone. What Japan had left, as the summer of 1942 turned toward autumn, was the 5th Carrier Division, the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, and a collection of smaller carriers and rebuilt air groups. The 2 finest carriers in the Japanese fleet had survived the first 6 months of war intact and were now carrying a strategic burden that 5 or 6 carriers had previously shared between them. The repair of the Shōkaku after the Coral Sea was completed with the urgency that the situation demanded. She rejoined the fleet in time for the Guadalcanal campaign, reunited with the Zuikaku in the 5th Carrier Division, the 2 ships falling back into the operational rhythms they had been building since their commissioning. Their reunion was not a triumphant return. It was a filling of a gap, the gap left by the 4 carriers lost at Midway, the gap in Japan's carrier capacity that could not fully be closed by any number of repair operations or training programs. When the Shōkaku and Zuikaku sortied together from Japanese home waters in the summer of 1942, they were doing so into a Pacific that had already shifted against them. The window of Japanese carrier dominance, the 6-month period between Pearl Harbor and Midway, during which the Kidō Butai could choose its engagements and fight on favorable terms, had closed. What lay ahead was a fighting retreat, conducted with skill and courage and occasional brilliance, but a retreat nonetheless. The absence from Midway cast a long shadow over the 5th Carrier Division's subsequent career in a way that was felt most acutely at the level of pilot quality. The veterans who had survived Coral Sea and been reconstituted into the Zuikaku's rebuilt airgroup were among the last practitioners of the pre-war standard of Japanese carrier aviation. As the war continued and losses accumulated, the replacement pilots arriving from the training pipeline were less experienced, less polished, less capable of the precise, coordinated attacks that Japanese carrier aviation had refined to an exceptional standard in the early war years. This gradual dilution of quality was not a sudden cliff edge. It was a slope gentle enough at first to be mistaken for mere fluctuation, steep enough by 1943 and 1944 to represent a fundamental change in what the 5th Carrier Division's air groups could realistically be expected to achieve against an increasingly capable and experienced enemy. The ships remained extraordinary. The men in the cockpits were working harder and harder to sustain results that had once seemed routine. There is a particular kind of melancholy in watching a great fighting force in the process of being worn down not by a single catastrophic defeat but by the slow arithmetic of attrition. One pilot here, one experienced maintenance crew chief there, one aircraft lost to a training accident, one veteran squadron leader rotated out of the combat zone before he can pass his knowledge to his replacements. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku, sailing together into the second half of 1942, embodied that melancholy without yet knowing it. They were still capable of extraordinary things. The battles ahead would prove that they remained dangerous, difficult to destroy, and capable of dealing severe damage to their enemies. But the foundation on which their capability rested, the deep pool of trained, experienced, combat-hardened aviators who had flown from their decks since Pearl Harbor, was being eroded by every engagement. The ghosts of Midway were not the men who died there. They were the men who should have been there and were not, and what their absence had meant for everyone who came after. Chapter 8. The Eastern Solomons, Battle in the Jungle Sea. August of 1942 arrived in the Solomon Islands as a season of sudden, violent change. The American landings on Guadalcanal on the 7th of that month, Operation Watchtower, called Operation Shoestring by the men who planned and executed it, in acknowledgement of the improvised, under-resourced nature of the whole enterprise, had reversed the strategic direction of the Pacific War with an abruptness that stunned even those on the American side who had authorized it. For 6 months, Japan had advanced. Now, for the first time, Japan was being pushed back. The Marines who waded ashore on Guadalcanal that morning and seized the partially built Japanese airfield were not, in the strategic calculus of the war, a large force. They were a declaration of intent. And Japan's response to that declaration was the thing that consumed the rest of the year in the Solomons and beyond. The Japanese response was swift and multifaceted. Naval forces struck back at the Allied amphibious fleet in the night action off Savo Island on the 9th of August, sinking 4 Allied cruisers in one of the most one-sided naval defeats in American naval history, but failing to press the advantage against the transports that had landed the Marines. Land-based aircraft from Rabaul began attacking Henderson Field and Allied shipping. Japanese destroyers began their nightly supply runs, what the Americans called the Tokyo Express, bringing reinforcements and supplies down the slot to the Japanese garrison that was already fighting the Marines on the island's jungle ridges and river crossings. The carrier forces on both sides moved into position. The stage was set for the second carrier battle of the Pacific War, which would be fought in the waters northeast of Guadalcanal in late August. It had a name, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The Eastern Solomons engagement on the 24th and 25th of August, 1942, brought the Shōkaku and Zuikaku back into carrier combat for the first time since the Coral Sea, 3 months earlier. The Japanese carrier force included both ships of the 5th Carrier Division, along with the light carrier Ryūjō operating in a separate group. The plan called for Ryūjō to act as a sacrificial decoy, drawing American attention and aircraft, while the 5th Division's heavy carriers positioned themselves to strike the American fleet. It was an aggressive plan, built on a willingness to accept the likely loss of a smaller carrier in exchange for the opportunity to catch the American carriers at a disadvantage. The plan had a certain cold logic to it. It also required that everything go precisely as intended, which battle has a persistent tendency to prevent. The American carrier force opposing the 5th Division consisted of the Enterprise and Saratoga, under the overall command of Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. American radar detected the incoming Japanese aircraft at ranges that gave the combat air patrol time to form up and intercept. The Ryujo was found and attacked by American aircraft. She was sunk, the decoy plan achieving its intended tactical result at the cost of a carrier and her crew. Japanese aircraft found the Enterprise and delivered a determined attack. The Enterprise was hit by 3 bombs, significant damage that put her out of action for repairs but did not sink her. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku launched their own strikes, and their aircraft contributed to the attack on the American carrier. But the American combat air patrol, guided by radar and increasingly experienced fighter direction, extracted a heavy toll from the attacking formations. Aircraft and pilots were lost in numbers that the Japanese, given their thinning reserves of trained aviators, could not replace quickly. The outcome of the Eastern Solomons was, on the narrow tactical ledger, something approaching a Japanese victory, a light carrier traded for serious damage to an American fleet carrier, with the Enterprise forced to withdraw for repairs that would keep her out of action for weeks. But the strategic ledger was different. Henderson Field was still in American hands. The Marines on Guadalcanal were still fighting. The supply line to the island garrison was still being contested. And the 5th Carrier Division had expended more of its precious, experienced aviators in an action whose results, while not unfavorable, had not achieved the decisive outcome that the strategic situation demanded. Each carrier engagement Japan fought in the waters around Guadalcanal followed this pattern tactical results that could be presented as something between a draw and a marginal victory, strategic results that failed to reverse the fundamental trajectory of the campaign. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku were doing what they had been built to do. They were doing it well. The problem was that doing it well was no longer sufficient. In the weeks following the Eastern Solomons, both carriers operated in the waters north of the Solomons, conducting flight operations, supporting Japanese naval efforts in the area, and providing the air cover that Japan's surface forces and supply runs required. It was operational work without the drama of a full carrier engagement, the kind of sustained, grinding deployment that tested machinery and men in ways that a single battle could not. The flight decks of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku were in constant use, their engineering departments managing the wear and tear of continuous operations in tropical heat, their air groups flying missions that did not always make the historical record but accumulated, day by day, into the experience and cohesion that distinguished a genuine combat unit from a collection of capable individuals. These were still formidable ships and formidable air groups. The months of fighting since Pearl Harbor had not broken them, they had hardened them. On the 31st of August, 1942, the Pacific War dealt another blow to American carrier strength in the Solomons region. The Saratoga was struck by a torpedo from a Japanese submarine and forced to withdraw for repairs. This left the Enterprise as the only operational American fleet carrier in the South Pacific, a situation of remarkable vulnerability that would, under different circumstances and different Japanese decision-making, have represented an extraordinary opportunity. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku, fully operational and in the area, represented the most powerful carrier striking force available to Japan in those waters. But the opportunity was not exploited with the aggression the moment demanded. The window of American carrier vulnerability passed without a decisive Japanese blow. It would not open again in quite the same way. The Americans repaired their damaged carriers, built new ones, trained new pilots, and the correlation of forces that had briefly tilted toward Japan tilted back and then continued tilting in the other direction. The period between the Eastern Solomons and the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands in October is, in most histories, a gap, a space between named engagements where the broader campaign continued, but the major carrier versus carrier confrontations paused. For the men on the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, it was no gap at all. The carriers were operational, their air groups were flying, and the Guadalcanal campaign was consuming resources and energy at a rate that had no pause button. Japanese destroyers running supplies down the slot were occasionally caught and sunk. American aircraft from Henderson Field attacked Japanese surface forces with increasing effectiveness as more and better aircraft arrived at the improvised airfield. The contest for the waters around Guadalcanal was not a battle with a front line. It was a campaign conducted across a geography of islands and channels and open ocean, and the Shōkaku and Zuikaku moved through it as the most powerful instruments of Japanese naval power in those waters, waiting for the next moment when everything would be concentrated into a single engagement. That moment was coming. It had a name: Santa Cruz. The strategic backdrop against which the Battle of Santa Cruz would be fought was a Japanese land offensive on Guadalcanal itself, timed to coincide with the naval battle. Japanese army forces were to assault Henderson Field and capture it from the Marines. The carrier force, including the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, was to be in position to exploit the resulting chaos, to neutralize American carrier interference with the subsequent reinforcement operations, and to consolidate Japanese control of the waters around the island. The army assault and the naval engagement were meant to be coordinated two halves of a single operation designed to solve the Guadalcanal problem once and for all. In the event, the coordination between army timing and naval timing was imperfect, as coordination between armies and navies tends to be under the pressures of actual war, but the carrier battle happened regardless. And it was, in terms of the damage inflicted and suffered, the most costly carrier engagement of the Pacific War to that point. The Shōkaku arrived at Santa Cruz already carrying the accumulated weight of a year of war. Her crew knew each other as men, only know each other after shared danger, the particular intimacy of people who have stood on the same deck in bad weather and worse combat and come through. Her airgroup was experienced by the standards of 1942 Japan, which meant they were very good, and getting better had become difficult because the best men were the ones most frequently risked in the hardest missions. As the carrier moved into position for what would be the fourth carrier battle of the Pacific War, the combination of quality and vulnerability that defined Japan's carrier aviation by late 1942 was fully present in the men on her decks. They were capable of remarkable things. They were also running out of the margin for error that fresh, rested, fully trained forces possess. The Battle of Santa Cruz would test both qualities to the limit. Chapter 9. Santa Cruz, Blood in the Trade Winds. The 26th of October, 1942, began before dawn on both sides, with scout aircraft launching into darkness from carrier decks on opposite sides of the same ocean, looking for each other. The search for the enemy fleet before a carrier battle had a quality entirely its own, an enormous area of open ocean, aircraft flying at search altitude on pre-planned patterns, pilots peering into the dark or the haze for the silhouette of an enemy ship, the white wake of an enemy formation, any sign that the opposing fleet was there and findable and real. On this morning, both sides found what they were looking for at roughly the same time. A Japanese scout aircraft located the American carriers Enterprise and Hornet northeast of the Santa Cruz Islands. American scouts found the Japanese carrier force, which included the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the fleet carrier Junyo, and the light carrier Zuiho to the northwest. The machinery of a carrier battle began turning, strikes launched, the trade winds blew, the Pacific waited. The Japanese launched their strike first, a large formation of aircraft from the Shōkaku and Zuikaku heading toward the American carriers. The Americans launched their strike minutes later, heading in the opposite direction. As at the Coral Sea 6 months earlier, the two strike formations passed each other somewhere in the sky between the opposing fleets, two streams of aircraft, loaded for catastrophic violence, crossing in the bright morning air above the Coral Sea, invisible to each other, each racing toward the other's home ships. It had happened at Coral Sea, it would happen here. The pattern of carrier battle in the Pacific, this peculiar symmetry of mutual destruction, each side striking the other's heart simultaneously, was by October 1942 becoming a familiar and terrible ritual. Familiar did not mean less deadly. The aircraft arriving over the American carriers carried the same lethal intent they had carried every other time. The American light carrier Zuiho was hit early in the battle by American aircraft, her flight deck damaged severely enough to prevent further aircraft operations. The main American strike then found the heavier Japanese carriers. The Shōkaku was the primary target. Her size, her speed, and her prominent island structure made her identifiable even in the stress of a combat attack run. American dive bombers came down on her from high altitude, and multiple bomb hits struck her flight deck and the spaces below it. Fires broke out. The forward section of the flight deck was destroyed. The internal damage was severe enough that Shōkaku could no longer conduct flight operations. She could not launch aircraft, could not recover aircraft, was functionally reduced from a carrier to a very large, fast, and heavily damaged surface warship. Her captain ordered the airgroup's still airborne aircraft to divert to other carriers. He turned the ship for Japan. The damage control parties went to work for the third time in a major battle. The Japanese strikes, meanwhile, had found the American carriers operating in clear tropical sky with no protective cloud cover. The Hornet was hit severely, multiple bomb hits and torpedo impacts reduced her to a dead ship, her crew fighting fires that were clearly uncontrollable. The Enterprise absorbed bomb hits and was badly damaged. The American destroyer Porter was lost. The Japanese attack was costly in terms of aircraft expended and aircrews lost, but its results were the most decisive Japanese tactical success in a carrier engagement since Pearl Harbor. By the end of the day's fighting, the Hornet was beyond saving and would be finished off by Japanese surface forces that evening, and the Enterprise was withdrawing with damage that would require substantial repair time. For a few days in late October of 1942, after Santa Cruz, there was not a single fully operational American fleet carrier in the South Pacific. Japan had achieved a tactical result that, in the language of pre-war naval planning, would have been celebrated as a major victory. The problem, the always present, increasingly urgent problem, was the cost at which this tactical result had been purchased. Japanese aircraft losses at Santa Cruz were severe. The precise figures remain somewhat uncertain in the historical record, but the consensus of historians is that the Japanese lost between 60 and 100 aircraft in the engagement, along with their crews. These were not aircraft losses that could be dismissed as acceptable. Every aircraft lost over Santa Cruz represented not just the machine but the trained pilot who flew it, the observer or gunner who accompanied him, and the months or years of instruction and accumulated combat experience that had made them effective. The irreplaceable quality of experienced carrier aviators, which had been eroding since Coral Sea and accelerating since Midway, was now in freefall. The Japanese carrier air groups that had opened the war were, by October of 1942, shadow versions of what they had been. What had once been a deep well of talent and training was becoming a shallow pool, draining faster than the training pipeline could refill it. The Shōkaku departed the Santa Cruz battle area under her own power, her engines undamaged, her hull intact below the waterline, her crew still fighting the fires that the American bombs had started in her forward sections. The damage control operations aboard the Shōkaku in those hours after Santa Cruz were a demonstration of the quality of her crew under conditions of extreme stress. They had done this before at Coral Sea. They had fought fires and flooding while other ships around them were engaged in combat, keeping their focus on the immediate task of saving the ship rather than the broader battle. They had succeeded then, they succeeded now. The fires were brought under control, the flooding was managed. The Shōkaku, trailing smoke, her flight deck a ruin, her air groups scattered to other carriers or lost, made her way north. She was alive, she was damaged. And she was heading back to Japan for the third time in a year and a half to undergo the repairs that would return her to the war. The Zuikaku, as she had done before in this war, had fought hard and come through without the catastrophic damage her sister suffered. Her aircraft had participated in the strikes on the American carriers. Her air group had paid a price in losses. But the ship herself was operational, battered in the way that all ships are battered by the stress of sustained high-speed maneuvering and the constant vibration of combat, but not structurally compromised, not on fire, not heading for the repair yards. She recovered what aircraft she could from the battle, took stock of what her air group had lost, and withdrew northward with the rest of the fleet. The Zuikaku carried something more than her aircraft and her crew out of Santa Cruz. She carried the knowledge which every surviving ship and every surviving man acquires in prolonged combat, that survival is not guaranteed by quality or by experience or by any virtue of skill or engineering. It is also, always, a matter of fortune. Santa Cruz had been, for the Zuikaku, a lucky day. How many lucky days remained was a question no one on her quarterdeck could answer. The aftermath of Santa Cruz was a period of intense, uncomfortable stock-taking on the Japanese side. The tactical results had been favorable. The Hornet was gone. The Enterprise was damaged. Japan had bought time in the waters around Guadalcanal. But time was precisely what Japan did not have in unlimited supply. The industrial output of the United States in 1942 was already surpassing anything Japan could match. New American carriers were being commissioned. New American pilots were completing training in numbers that the Japanese pipeline could not approach. The Hornet's replacement would come out of the American yards in months. The replacement for Japan's lost and damaged pilots was a matter of years. Japan did not have. The strategists who looked at the Santa Cruz results and saw victory were technically correct on the day's terms. The strategists who looked at the same results and saw the arithmetic of eventual defeat were reading the numbers more honestly. The Shōkaku's third major repair period, the most extensive yet occupied the months following Santa Cruz. Yokosuka Naval Arsenal received a ship that had been to war 3 times and borne the brunt of serious combat damage twice. The forward flight deck had to be completely rebuilt. Internal structural damage required extensive attention. Systems that had been patched and improvised in the field were properly addressed. The workmen and engineers who spent those months on the Shōkaku's repair were doing more than fixing a damaged carrier. They were, in the most literal possible sense, keeping Japan's most capable carrier in the fight, making possible the future engagements at which she would appear, the future battles she would influence, and ultimately the future that would claim her. The repair of the Shōkaku after Santa Cruz was, like everything else about these 2 ships, an act of extraordinary human effort in the service of a strategic objective that the arithmetic of the war was quietly, inexorably undermining. The year 1942 ended with Guadalcanal still contested, the attrition of both sides still grinding, and the strategic direction of the Pacific War now unmistakably turned against Japan. The carriers that had opened the war in such devastating fashion were reduced to the Shōkaku in the repair yards and the Zuikaku, whose air group had been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt again, with replacement pilots of diminishing average experience. The empire that had built these ships in the confidence of 1937 was not the empire that was fighting the war of early 1943. The confidence had been replaced by something harder and more complicated, a determination to continue, born less from genuine belief in ultimate victory and more from the inability to conceive of any other course. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku would continue to fight, that much was certain. The question of what their fighting could achieve, in a war that had already passed its turning point, was one that the records and the strategy papers and the admiral's diaries of early 1943 answer, collectively and uncomfortably, with silence. Chapter 10. The Long Pause. Rebuilding in the Shadow of Defeat. 1943 is, in the history of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, a year of comparative quiet, and that comparative quiet is itself a story worth telling. The 2 great carrier battles of the year's second half, which would be fought in the waters around Guadalcanal and the broader Solomon Islands theatre, did not feature both ships in the primary carrier engagement role they had occupied at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. Japan's carrier aviation, its aircraft, its experienced pilots, its operational doctrine was in the process of a forced reconstruction that the scale and pace of losses in 1942 had made unavoidable. The Shōkaku was in the repair yards. The Zuikaku was in home waters, her air group being rebuilt for the 3rd time. The Pacific was still burning. The Guadalcanal campaign was grinding toward its conclusion, and the 2 finest carriers Japan possessed were, for much of this period, watching the war from the sidelines. The evacuation of Guadalcanal in February of 1943 was conducted with a skill and precision that stood in almost painful contrast to the losses incurred defending the island. Japanese destroyers, operating at night over 3 nights in early February, successfully extracted approximately 11,000 men from the island under conditions that Allied intelligence initially mistook for a reinforcement run. It was a tactical success, a professionally executed withdrawal under difficult conditions. But it was also the acknowledgement that Japan had lost the campaign that had consumed so much of its naval aviation strength and so many of its irreplaceable surface warships since August of the previous year. Guadalcanal would become an American base. Henderson Field, the airfield that the Marines had seized and fought and died for, would host American aircraft that would continue the drive up the Solomon Islands chain toward Rabaul and beyond. The first offensive campaign of the Pacific War had ended in a Japanese defeat. For the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the months of 1943 that followed the Guadalcanal evacuation were a period of rebuilding, training, and the accumulation of the new pilots who would replace those lost in the previous year's fighting. The training pipeline that Japan operated for carrier aviators was producing graduates, but the gap between the men coming out of training in 1943 and the veterans who had flown at Pearl Harbor was significant and growing. The pre-war standard of Japanese carrier aviation had been built on years of selection and training. The original carrier airgroups had been chosen from large numbers of candidates and then trained to extraordinary standards of precision and endurance. The replacement pilots of 1943 had been processed through a pipeline that had been compressed and accelerated to meet the operational demands of a war running hotter and faster than anyone had planned for. They were not bad pilots. They were less experienced pilots in aircraft that had not materially improved since 1941, flying against an enemy whose aircraft, tactics, and technology were all improving at a rate Japan could not match. The aircraft that had made the Japanese carrier air groups so formidable in 1941 were beginning to show their age relative to the enemy's improving capabilities. The Zero fighter, which had been genuinely superior to anything the Americans had in the Pacific in the opening months of the war, was encountering the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter in growing numbers from late 1943 onward. The Hellcat had been designed specifically to defeat the Zero, and it succeeded. It was faster in a dive, better armed, better protected, and capable of absorbing damage that would have destroyed a Zero. The D-3A dive bomber and B-5N torpedo bomber that had made the strikes at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea so devastating were, by 1943 and 1944, obsolescent against American defenses that included radar-directed combat air patrols and better-trained fighter direction officers. Japan was aware of these gaps. The industrial and technical resources to close them were not available on the timeline the war demanded. Operation Igo, launched in April of 1943, represented an attempt to reverse the air situation in the Solomons through a concentrated offensive use of carrier-based aircraft operating from land bases. Aircraft from the Shōkaku, Zuikaku, and other carriers were temporarily disembarked to airfields in the Rabaul area for a series of mass airstrikes against Allied shipping and airfields in the Solomons. The operation produced results that were, in the Japanese assessment at the time, encouraging. Estimates of damage inflicted were significantly higher than the actual losses suffered by the Allies, a persistent problem with Japanese battle damage assessment throughout the war. The actual results were less encouraging. Allied losses were modest, Japanese aircraft and pilot losses were significant, and the operation consumed experienced aviation assets from the carrier air groups without achieving the decisive change in air superiority that its planners had intended. The carrier aircraft that flew in Igo and did not return to their ships were assets that would not be available for the next carrier engagement. The broader Pacific strategic situation in 1943 continued to deteriorate from Japan's perspective, with a relentlessness that no individual operational success could arrest. American forces were advancing through the central and southwestern Pacific on converging lines. The island chains that Japan had seized in the opening months of the war were becoming battlefields. The logistical network that sustained Japan's forward garrisons already stretched thin was being attacked by American submarines, with increasing effectiveness as the torpedo reliability problems that had plagued the early war period were progressively solved. Japanese merchant shipping losses were rising. The oil that fueled the fleet had to travel from the Dutch East Indies through waters increasingly contested by American submarines. The strategic pressure on Japan was not a crisis visible in any single engagement. It was a tightening, a slow constriction of options and resources and time that the admirals in Tokyo could feel but could not reverse. The Shōkaku completed her repairs and rejoined the fleet in the course of 1943, reuniting with the Zuikaku in what was now a significantly changed carrier fleet. The two original members of the 5th Carrier Division were still together, still the most experienced and capable carriers Japan possessed, but now operating in a fleet that had been restructured and renamed. The reorganization of Japan's carrier forces into what would become the first mobile fleet reflected the losses and rebuilding of the previous 2 years. New carriers had been commissioned, conversions of merchant hulls and hybrid battleship carrier designs, ships that added deck, space and aircraft capacity to the fleet, but could not provide the experienced air groups that would have made them genuinely powerful. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku remained the core of whatever striking power Japan's carrier fleet still possessed. Around them, a rebuilt fleet was taking shape, larger in some respects than what had existed after Midway, but fundamentally weaker in the quality of its most essential component, the men in the cockpits. The training exercises of 1943 and early 1944, conducted in the home waters of Japan and in the waters around the Mariana Islands, had the quality of preparation against a clock that everyone knew was running faster than the training could keep up with. Pilots practiced attack profiles, navigation, carrier landing procedures, and the coordinated multi-aircraft formations that were the signature of Japanese carrier aviation doctrine. But the hours were not sufficient. The instructors were stretched across too many new students, and the attrition of training itself, accidents, mechanical failures, the ordinary hazards of learning to fly from a carrier deck ate into the numbers before the men ever reached a combat zone. The admirals reviewing training reports understood that the air groups they were building were not the air groups that had flown at Pearl Harbor. They understood it, noted it, planned around it as best they could, and sent the ships and men they had into the next operation regardless. There was no alternative that did not involve accepting strategic defeat. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku, repaired and rearmed and fully manned through the course of 1943, were by the beginning of 1944 the anchors of Japan's carrier striking capability in a very specific and weighty sense. They were the ships that combined genuine combat experience accumulated through every major carrier engagement since Pearl Harbor, with the engineering quality of the finest carrier design Japan had produced. Their crews were veterans, their machinery was tested, their damage control parties had performed under fire and knew what they were doing. In a fleet that was in many respects a rebuilt structure over a shattered foundation, the two crane carriers were the closest thing to genuine continuity with the fleet that had opened the war. The battle that was coming, the engagement in the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, would test them as they had never been tested before. Not by the quality of their own performance, which was never genuinely in question, but by the quality of what stood against them. And what stood against them, in the summer of 1944, was the most powerful and capable carrier force in the history of naval warfare up to that date. The reckoning was approaching. Chapter 11, Philippine Sea, the Turkey Shoot and the Soaring Crane's Final Hours. By June of 1944, the American carrier force in the Pacific had become something qualitatively different from anything that had existed in the Sea War before. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, consisted of 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers protected by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in a ring of defensive firepower, guided by radar systems that could detect incoming aircraft at ranges measured in dozens of miles, directed by fighter control officers who had spent 3 years refining the art of using that information to put Hellcat fighters in exactly the right place at the right time. The carriers themselves were newer, larger, and faster than their predecessors. The aircraft on their decks, Hellcats, Avengers, Helldivers, Corsairs, were, aircraft for aircraft, superior to the Japanese equivalents in almost every metric that mattered in a contested air environment. The men flying those aircraft were, on average, better trained and more experienced than their Japanese counterparts. The gap between the two carrier forces in June of 1944 was not primarily a gap in numbers. It was a gap in quality that ran all the way down to the individual pilot in the individual cockpit. The Japanese plan for the defense of the Marianas, Operation Eigo, assigned the 1st Mobile Fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa to seek a decisive engagement with the American carrier force in the Philippine Sea. The plan incorporated a specific tactical assumption that proved to be critically flawed: that land-based aircraft from airfields in the Marianas, the Carolines, and other island bases would be able to participate in the battle, essentially doubling the effective air strength available to Ozawa. If this had been achievable, the combined air strength of land-based and carrier-based Japanese aircraft would have approached the numbers available to Task Force 58. But American airstrikes had been systematically attacking those same airfields in the weeks preceding the battle, and the land-based aircraft that Ozawa counted on to supplement his carriers had been largely destroyed or driven from their fields before the carrier engagement began. The plan was built on a foundation that had already been removed. The Japanese carriers would fight essentially alone. Ozawa organized his fleet in a way designed to maximize striking range, positioning his carriers far enough back from the American fleet that his aircraft could reach and attack Task Force 58, while American aircraft, with their somewhat shorter combat range, could not easily reach the Japanese carriers in return. The logic was sound. If the Japanese could conduct one-way shuttle attacks, landing on the now American-controlled Marianas airfields after striking the American fleet and then returning to their carriers, they could strike at range without exposing the carriers to immediate counterattack. It was a plan built on flexibility of concept and precision of execution. What it could not account for was the degree to which American radar, American fighter direction, and American pilot quality would strip away the impact of those long-range strikes before they could reach and damage their targets. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku sailed into the Philippine Sea as the two most capable and most experienced vessels in Ozawa's fleet. The ships were in good material condition, repaired, refueled, armed with whatever aircraft and pilots the Japanese training system had been able to produce. Their crews were veterans of years of Pacific carrier warfare. The captains on their bridges had commanded these ships through more combat operations than most naval officers on either side of the war would ever see. As the 19th of June, 1944, arrived the day that would determine the fate of both ships and, in the larger sense, the fate of Japan's carrier striking power, there was nothing left to prepare. The fleet was in position. The battle had begun. The Japanese launched 4 waves of aircraft on the morning of the 19th of June. The first wave alone consisted of more than 60 aircraft. American radar operators watching their scopes saw the incoming formations at ranges that gave the fighter direction officers time to scramble and position their combat air patrols in altitude and heading. The Hellcat pilots who climbed to meet the incoming Japanese waves were not surprised, were not outnumbered, and were not outclassed in their aircraft. What followed in the air above the Philippine Sea was not a battle between matched adversaries. It was a systematic destruction. The Japanese formations, many of them composed of pilots who had significantly less combat experience than the men they were attacking, were met by Hellcats that had the advantages of altitude, information, superior aircraft performance, and 3 years of refined tactical doctrine. Wave after wave of Japanese aircraft was broken up, dispersed, and destroyed before most of them could reach the American carriers. More than 300 Japanese aircraft were lost that day. The combat air patrols of Task Force 58 had functioned at a level of effectiveness that no previous carrier battle had produced on either side. The men on the American carriers gave it its name, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. While the destruction of Ozawa's air groups was happening in the sky above the Philippine Sea, a different and equally fatal event was occurring beneath the surface of the sea beneath the Shōkaku. The American submarine USS Kavala had been tracking the Japanese carrier force and had maneuvered into position for an attack. At approximately midday on the 19th of June, the Kavala fired a spread of torpedoes at the Shōkaku. 3 struck. The carrier came to a dead stop. Her damage control parties, the men who had fought the fires at Coral Sea, who had brought her home from Santa Cruz, who had developed over 3 years of war, a collective expertise in keeping this particular ship alive, went to work with the same focused efficiency they had always brought to the task. They isolated flooded compartments. They fought the fires that the torpedo explosions had started. They worked, as they had always worked, with extraordinary skill and courage. This time, it was not enough. The fundamental vulnerability of the Shōkaku's enclosed hangar design, the design characteristic that engineers and historians had identified as her most dangerous flaw since before the war began, had its final, catastrophic expression on the afternoon of the 19th of June, 1944. The torpedo hits had ruptured fuel lines. Aviation gasoline vapor had been accumulating in the enclosed spaces of the hull. One spark, one thermal event, one chemical interaction in the wrong space at the wrong moment, and the accumulated vapor ignited. A massive internal explosion tore through the ship. The flooding became uncontrollable. The Shōkaku rolled to starboard and went down approximately 140 miles north of the island of Yap at 14 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. 1,263 men were lost. 570 survivors were recovered by the escorting destroyer Urakaze, which was itself conducting these rescue operations while under threat from the submarine that had just sunk the carrier. The loss of the Shōkaku on the 19th of June, 1944, brought to an end one of the most eventful careers of any warship on either side of the Pacific War. In less than 3 years of service, she had attacked Pearl Harbor, swept through the Indian Ocean, fought at the Coral Sea, fought at the Eastern Solomons, fought at Santa Cruz, survived 3 major bouts of battle damage, completed 3 major repair periods, and returned to the line each time. She had been, in every meaningful sense, the most combat-tested carrier in the Japanese fleet, more battered, more repaired, and more persistently returned to service than any comparable vessel. The fact that she had survived as long as she did was a testament to the quality of her construction and to the skill and courage of her damage control crews. The fact that she was gone was a consequence of a design vulnerability that no amount of courage could ultimately overcome. The soaring crane had reached the end of its flight. The Zuikaku survived the 19th of June. Her aircraft had been launched into the same skies where most of them were destroyed. Her position in the fleet and the particulars of her navigation that day kept her from the submarine attack that had found her sister. As the sun set on the Philippine Sea and the scale of the catastrophe became clear, the hundreds of aircraft lost, the Shōkaku gone, the strategic objective of the Marianas' defense irretrievably failed. The Zuikaku was still afloat, still operational, and now unambiguously the last survivor of the 6 carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor less than 3 years earlier. It was a distinction that had become increasingly solitary. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu lost at Midway. The Shōkaku gone now, beneath 100 fathoms of the Philippine Sea. Only the fortunate crane remained. And the fortune that had protected her through 3 years of the most intense carrier warfare in history was, though she could not yet know it, nearly spent. Chapter 12. Zuikaku alone. The last crane faces the inevitable. There is a particular quality to the position of the last survivor. Not just strategically, though, the strategic weight of being the final operational fleet carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force was considerable, but in the deeper, less easily quantified sense of carrying a history. The Zuikaku, as the summer of 1944 gave way to autumn, was not simply a warship. She was the last institutional memory of a Japanese carrier fleet that had, at its peak, constituted the most powerful and cohesive carrier striking force ever assembled. Every other ship that had sailed with her from the Kurile Islands in November of 1941 was gone. Some had been sunk in battle, some had been lost to submarine attack. The 4 carriers of the 1st and 2nd Divisions were all lost at Midway. the Shōkaku was at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The Zuikaku alone remained from the force that had changed the world on the 7th of December, 1941. The weight of that survival was not metaphorical, it was operational. Everything Japan's carrier fleet could still attempt, it attempted through her. The aftermath of the Philippine Sea disaster was the final systematic destruction of Japan's carrier aviation as an operational force. The 300-plus aircraft lost in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot represented not just machines and fuel, they represented the trained pilots who flew them, the observers and gunners in the rear seats, the months of instruction and the accumulated combat instinct that made the difference between a pilot who survived a first engagement and a pilot who won it. Japan's carrier aviation reserve, the pool of trained, experienced, combat-capable aircrew that had been deep in 1941 and shallow by 1943, was, after the Philippine Sea, essentially exhausted. There were aircraft still available, there were men entering the training pipeline, but the combination of experienced pilots, modern aircraft, and operational carrier decks that constituted a functioning carrier air power establishment was no longer present in anything approaching the numbers required to contest American air superiority in the Central Pacific. The Zuikaku was sent back to Japan for replenishment after the Philippine Sea battle. The ship herself was unharmed, her machinery was in good working order. Her crew, veterans of 3 years of Pacific carrier operations, were alive and functional. What she needed was an air group, and providing an air group that was genuinely capable of combat operations against the American carrier forces she would face in the next engagement was the task that the Japanese naval aviation training establishment could not adequately fulfill on the available timeline. The pilots who came aboard the Zuikaku in the weeks after the Philippine Sea were not incompetent. They were simply young in hours, young in combat experience, young in the specific, practiced instincts that distinguished the veterans of Pearl Harbor from the men who had replaced them. The Zuikaku went back to sea carrying the institutional reputation of the finest carrier in the Japanese Navy, manned by an air group that could not fully sustain that reputation in the air. The strategic situation Japan faced in the autumn of 1944 was one of rapidly narrowing options. American forces had taken Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The long-range bombers that Japanese strategists had most feared were already being based in the Marianas. American submarines were strangling the sea lanes between Japan and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. The fuel that kept the fleet operational was becoming dangerously difficult to deliver to the home islands. The Philippines, which sat across those sea lanes like a cork in a bottle, were the next American objective. Their loss would effectively sever Japan's fuel supply and render the fleet unable to operate at full capacity within months. The defense of the Philippines was, therefore, not a matter of strategic preference but of strategic necessity. Japan had to fight for the Philippines. It had no choice. And the Zuikaku was going to be part of that fight. The plan for the defense of the Philippines Operation Shōichigo was a vast, complex, and in retrospect almost impossibly ambitious scheme that committed essentially every significant surface warship Japan still possessed to a coordinated attack on the Allied invasion fleet in Leyte Gulf. The Zuikaku was assigned to the Northern Force under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, the same officer who had commanded the carrier force in the Philippine Sea. Ozawa's Northern Force, built around the Zuikaku and several smaller carriers, was assigned a role that the officers who planned it understood with painful clarity was not the role of a genuine striking force. The air groups of the Northern Force were too small, too inexperienced, and too undermanned to constitute a real offensive capability against Task Force 38, the American carrier force that was now the most powerful naval air arm in history. Ozawa's carriers were to serve as bait sailing south to attract the attention of Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, drawing it away from the San Bernardino and Surigao Straits, through which the Japanese surface forces would pass to attack the invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. The Zuikaku sailed into the Battle of Cape Engano on the 25th of October, 1944, as the flagship of a force that was, in the most fundamental sense, intended to be sacrificed. Ozawa flew his flag from her, the ship that had once launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor, that had fought through the Coral Sea and Santa Cruz and the Philippine Sea, that had survived everything the Pacific War had thrown at her across nearly 3 years of combat, was now sailing toward the American carrier forces as a decoy. She was bait for a trap designed to give Japan's surface forces one last opportunity to inflict a decisive blow on the Allied invasion fleet. The strategic irony of this Japan's finest remaining carrier, stripped of effective air power, serving as a lure to draw away the most powerful carrier force the world had ever assembled, was not lost on the officers who planned it, or on the men who served in her. Vice Admiral Mitch's airstrikes began arriving over Ozawa's fleet before 8 in the morning. The Zuikaku's remaining aircraft were launched to intercept and to strike at the American carriers a small number of aircraft, far fewer than the carrier had once routinely operated, flown by men who understood the odds they faced. Most did not return. The combat air patrols of Task Force 38 found the Japanese aircraft and destroyed most of them before they reached the American ships. The first American strike wave concentrated on the lighter carriers of Ozawa's force, sinking the Chitose and crippling the Chiyoda. A torpedo from the first strike wave struck the Zuikaku, not fatal, not yet, but serious enough to force Ozawa to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Oyodo. The ship that had carried Japan's carrier flag through 3 years of war had lost her admiral. She was still fighting, still maneuvering, still alive. But the forces converging on her were not forces that a single ship, however well built and however bravely, could survive indefinitely. The third and fourth strike waves were already forming on the American carrier decks to the south. The Zuikaku's time was being measured now in hours, not days. The second major American strike wave found the Zuikaku still underway, still maneuvering, her anti-aircraft guns firing with the determination that her crew had always brought to that increasingly unequal contest. 3 more torpedoes struck her in this second wave, delivered by Avenger torpedo bombers whose pilots had been trained in a system that, by 1944, was producing men of exceptional skill in enormous numbers. The flooding spread through the ship's lower spaces, the pumps fought it and fell behind. The list to port increased with a slow, heavy inevitability that no amount of counter-flooding could arrest. The damage control parties, men who in another ship and another time might have saved her, as their counterparts had saved the Shōkaku at Coral Sea, and Santa Cruz worked with everything they had in spaces that were filling with water and dark. They could not stop what was happening. The ship was going over. The crew of the Zuikaku knew, as the list increased past the point of recovery, what was required of them. The Imperial battle flag, the flag that had flown from her mast since her commissioning in September of 1941, the flag that had been in the wind above Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea and the Indian Ocean and every other place this ship had been in 3 years of war, was lowered for the last time. The survivors of her crew assembled on the tilting flight deck. What happened next has been described by the few men who survived it and were recovered from the sea in the hours that followed. The crew of the last Pearl Harbor carrier standing together on a deck that was no longer level, rendering a final salute to the flag they were lowering, a gesture that in its simplicity carried the full weight of everything the ship and the fleet and the campaign had been. The Zuikaku rolled to port and sank at 14 minutes past 2 in the afternoon on the 25th of October, 1944. The fortunate crane was gone. The loss of the Zuikaku at Cape Engano closed a chapter in naval history that had opened less than 3 years before in the cold waters north of Hawaii. She was the last operational carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, the last ship that had been present at the moment Japan had chosen to go to war with the United States in the most dramatic and consequential fashion available. To it. With her went the final institutional connection between the carrier fleet that had opened the Pacific War and the remnant naval forces that were still, in October of 1944, trying to fight it. The Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, the Hiryu had all gone to the bottom at Midway in June of 1942. The Shōkaku had gone down in the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. And now, the Zuikaku, the last of them all, had followed. Japan still had ships. Japan still had men willing to fight in them. But the carrier force that had represented the sharp edge of Japanese naval power, the instrument that had been sharpened through decades of training and doctrine and hard-won operational experience, no longer existed. The decoy plan, for all the cost at which it was executed, achieved its intended tactical result with a strange, painful precision. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet had taken the bait. The Northern Force had drawn Task Force 38 north with exactly the single-mindedness that Ozawa had intended. The Japanese surface forces in the center had passed through San Bernardino Strait and had found themselves, briefly, in a position to attack the Allied invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. The surface battle that followed the engagement against the thin screen of destroyers, destroyer escorts, and small escort carriers designated Taffy 3 was one of the most remarkable defensive actions in naval history, with a handful of small ships fighting a force of battleships and cruisers to a standstill through a combination of desperate courage, aggressive torpedo attack, and the Japanese commander's decision to withdraw when he was, on the surface of the tactical situation, close to achieving a decisive result. The Zuikaku had died for a plan that almost worked. Whether almost in those waters on that day represented a tragic near-miss, or the inevitable result of a strategic situation that had been irretrievable for 2 years, is a question historians are still arguing. The men who survived the sinking of the Zuikaku were recovered by Japanese destroyers in the waters off Cape Engano. They had been part of one of the most remarkable ships in the history of the Pacific War, a ship that had been present at the beginning of everything and present at the end of it, that had fought through more carrier engagements than any other Japanese carrier and survived them all until the very last one. The survivors carried their memories and their experience, and the specific grief of men who have watched a ship that they loved go under. They were taken to Japan, to a nation that was entering the final and most terrible phase of a war it could no longer win, where they would serve in whatever capacity remained available as the conflict ground toward its conclusion. The Zuikaku story was over. The war's story was not. What the Zuikaku had been, what both the Shōkaku and Zuikaku together had been, from the drawing boards of 1936 to the depths of the Philippine Sea and the waters off Cape Engano, was the finest expression of Japanese carrier doctrine and Japanese naval engineering of their era. They had been built without compromise when the treaty constraints were lifted, designed by men who knew exactly what they wanted and had, for the first and only time, the freedom to build it. They had been commissioned into a navy that had spent 2 decades cultivating the most skilled carrier aviation corps in the world. They had been sent to war with an air group that was, in 1941 and the early months of 1942, the most capable combination of aircraft and trained aviators flying from any carrier deck on Earth. Everything that Japanese naval aviation could be, at the moment of its greatest strength, these 2 ships embodied. And the story of their decline from the devastating strikes of Pearl Harbor to the hollow decoy operation at Cape Engano is not primarily a story about ships. It is a story about the irreplaceable nature of trained human expertise and what happens when that expertise is consumed faster than it can be regenerated. The ships themselves remained formidable to the end. The Shōkaku was hit by torpedoes and destroyed by the vulnerability of her own fuel stores after 3 years of surviving everything else the Pacific War threw at her. The Zuikaku was overwhelmed by numbers and quality on both sides of the water aircraft above and torpedoes below against a force that had grown, through 3 years of industrial production and systematic training, into something Japan could not match. The engineering that built the ships was extraordinary. The men who crewed them were extraordinary. The attrition of the human expertise that made those extraordinary ships genuinely dangerous. That is the thread that runs from Coral Sea through Midway, through Santa Cruz and the Eastern Solomons and the Philippine Sea, all the way to Cape Engano. Pull that thread, and the whole story unravels into something clear and permanent and profound. If you are still awake at the end of Chapter 12, welcome back from wherever this narration took you. We are halfway through the complete history of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, and the next 6 chapters will take us deeper into the men who flew from these ships, the decisions that shaped their fates, the counterfactuals that historians have never stopped arguing over, and the long afterlife of 2 ships that the Pacific has kept in its depths for more than 80 years. Chapters 13 through 18 are coming. If this is the kind of history that fills your nights with something worth dreaming about, subscribe, leave a comment about which moment in this story stopped you cold, and come back for the second half. The cranes have flown, the ocean keeps their secrets, and we are only halfway done. Chapter 13. The men behind the machines, commanders, pilots, and the human architecture of the 5th Division. Every ship in the history of naval warfare has been, at its most fundamental level, a collection of human beings organized around a piece of machinery. The machinery matters, the thickness of the armor, the power of the engines, the capacity of the hangars, but the machinery does not make decisions. The men do. And in the case of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the men who commanded them, who flew from their decks, who maintained their engines and fought their fires and navigated their courses through 3 years of the most intense naval warfare the world had ever seen, were as extraordinary as the ships themselves. To tell the story of these carriers without telling the story of the people who operated them is to tell only half the truth. The steel and the rivets and the flight deck planking are the skeleton. The men are everything else. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the Kidō Butai, the force of which the 5th Carrier Division was a part from its formation, through the Pearl Harbor attack, the Indian Ocean raid, and the Battle of Midway. Nagumo is one of the most complicated figures in the entire history of the Pacific War, a man whose reputation has been shaped more by the decisions he made at Midway than by the full arc of his career. He was a torpedo and surface warfare specialist who found himself in command of the world's most powerful carrier striking force, a position that required a depth of understanding of carrier aviation doctrine that his background had not fully prepared him for. At Pearl Harbor, his caution in declining to order a 3rd strike wave, a decision that left the American fuel storage facilities and repair infrastructure intact at Pearl Harbor, has been argued over ever since. At Midway, his hesitation at a critical moment of the battle contributed to the loss of all 4 carriers under his command. But this is the simplified reading, the one that makes Nagumo a convenient explanation for outcomes that had many causes. The fuller reading is more complicated and more human. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, who commanded the 5th Carrier Division directly from the Hiryu at Midway, rather than from the Shōkaku or Zuikaku, the 5th Division's 2 ships, having been left behind after Coral Sea, was, by every account, one of the most gifted carrier commanders Japan produced in the Pacific War. He had studied at Princeton University in the 1920s, spoke English, and possessed a tactical aggressiveness that marked him out even in a fleet not short of aggressive officers. At Midway, it was Yamaguchi who urged Nagumo to launch immediately against the American carriers with the aircraft available, rather than waiting to rearm and coordinate a larger strike, a recommendation that, had it been followed, might have changed the battle's outcome. Yamaguchi chose to go down with the Hiryu when she was sunk at Midway. He sent his men away in the lifeboats and remained on the bridge as the carrier settled. The 5th Carrier Division that the Shōkaku and Zuikaku had formed with their sister ships had, in the space of a single battle they did not even fight in, lost its most brilliant commander. The pilots who flew from the Shōkaku and Zuikaku were drawn from a selection and training process that was, in the pre-war years and the early war period, among the most rigorous in the world. The Imperial Japanese Navy's pilot selection program examined thousands of candidates and accepted a fraction men who met extraordinarily high physical and cognitive standards, who then entered a training regimen of exceptional intensity and duration. The result, by 1941, was a corps of carrier aviators whose individual skill levels exceeded those of their equivalents in any other navy at the time. A veteran Zero pilot from the Pearl Harbor airgroups was the product of years of formation flying, aerobatics, gunnery practice, navigation training, and carrier qualification, a human instrument refined to a remarkable standard of precision. The men who flew at Pearl Harbor and the Coral Sea and the Indian Ocean were not merely competent, they were, many of them, genuinely exceptional. And they were, in the mathematics of the war that followed, irreplaceable. The torpedo bomber crews who flew the Nakajima B-5N Kate from the decks of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku occupied a particular position in the hierarchy of danger. A torpedo attack required the pilot to fly low and slow, at roughly 100 meters altitude, at a speed that made the aircraft a relatively easy target for anti-aircraft guns and defending fighters directly toward the enemy ship, holding the approach steady through whatever fire was directed at the aircraft until the torpedo release point was reached. There was no margin for evasive action in the final stages of a properly executed torpedo run. The men who flew these missions understood what they were accepting when they climbed into the cockpit. The crews who made the torpedo attacks at Pearl Harbor, who struck the Lexington at the Coral Sea, who delivered the hits on the Hornet at Santa Cruz, these men flew into defenses that were designed specifically to kill them, at speeds and altitudes that maximized the defender's advantage and minimized their own. The courage required for this kind of work was not the courage of a single sudden moment. It was the courage of a man who knows exactly what is coming and flies toward it anyway. The dive bomber crews of the HED-3A Val occupied a different kind of danger. Where the torpedo bomber pilot flew low and level, the dive bomber pilot climbed to altitude and then committed to a near-vertical dive toward the target, releasing the bomb at close range and then pulling out through the envelope of anti-aircraft fire that surrounded every warship in the later years of the war. The physical demands of the dive, the G-forces of the pull-out, the wind blast, the disorientation of the vertical approach were extreme. The psychological demands were their own kind. The Val crews who put bombs on the Shōkaku at the Coral Sea and at Santa Cruz were flying the same aircraft type against the same kind of defenses that the Shōkaku's own dive bomber crews had flown against American carriers. The symmetry of that mutual violence dive bombers from both sides executing the same dangerous maneuver against opponents who knew exactly what was coming is one of the defining images of the Pacific Carrier War. The engineering and maintenance personnel of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku have received far less attention in the historical record than the pilots and commanders, but their contribution to the operational effectiveness of both ships was not secondary, it was foundational. Keeping the aircraft of a carrier air group in flyable condition under the stress of sustained combat operations in the tropical heat and corrosive salt air of the Pacific, with supply chains that were never as reliable as the operational tempo demanded, required a level of mechanical skill and improvisational resourcefulness that rivaled anything the pilots in the cockpits were doing. The maintenance crews who worked through the night between sorties, who cannibalized damaged aircraft for parts to repair others, who diagnosed and fixed faults in engines and hydraulic systems and radio equipment in conditions that would have challenged a well-equipped shore facility. These men were the invisible infrastructure of the 5th Division's fighting power. Their names do not appear in the battle dispatches. Their work made every sortie possible. The damage control organization aboard the Shōkaku deserves particular recognition because its performance across the carrier's 3 major damage episodes, Coral Sea, Santa Cruz, and the Philippine Sea, tells a story of exceptional collective capability under extraordinary stress. A damage control team on a warship is not simply a firefighting crew. It is a network of trained, organized personnel distributed throughout the ship, each group responsible for a section of the hull, each equipped with specific tools and materials, each trained in the specific procedures for managing the kinds of damage that carrier operations produce: fire, flooding, structural failure, loss of power. The Shōkaku's damage control organization saved the ship at Coral Sea, when fires below decks and flooding from bomb damage could easily have been fatal. They saved her again at Santa Cruz, when the condition of her forward sections after multiple bomb hits was severe enough that many ships would not have survived. The fact that the Philippine Sea torpedoes and the internal explosion that followed finally overcame them does not diminish what they had achieved in the years before. They saved their ship twice. The third time was beyond saving by any human effort. The enlisted men of both carriers, the ordinary seamen, the gunners, the engine room ratings, the cooks and signalmen and radio operators, and the hundreds of other specialist ratings that a carrier of this size required to function, were drawn from a Japan that was, in 1941, a society of deep hierarchical order and intense collective identity. The naval service, for many of these men, was the most significant institution in their lives outside their families. The relationship between a Japanese sailor and his ship was not merely contractual, it carried emotional and cultural weight that was specific to the time and place in which these men lived. The ship was home, the crew was family, and the purpose of both was service to something larger than either. This cultural context does not explain every decision made aboard the Shōkaku and Zuikaku in 3 years of war, but it illuminates the quality of commitment that those ships commanded from the men who served in them, a commitment that expressed itself in the damage control parties who fought for hours to save a sinking ship, in the pilots who kept flying as the air groups around them were destroyed, and in the crew members of the Zuikaku who stood on a tilting deck at Cape Engano and rendered their final salute to a flag they were lowering for the last time. The human architecture of the 5th Carrier Division, its commanders, pilots, aircrew, engineers, damage control specialists, and thousands of ordinary sailors was as much a designed and constructed thing as the ships themselves. It was built through selection and training, an accumulated experience, and the specific chemistry of men who have lived and worked and fought together under conditions of extreme pressure. Like the ships, it was extraordinary when it was new and fully formed. Like the ships, it was eroded by the war that consumed it pilot by pilot, experienced petty officer by experienced petty officer, battle by battle. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku were not defeated by better ships or braver men on the other side. They were defeated by a nation that could replace what the fighting consumed faster than Japan could, and by the arithmetic of an industrial war that rewarded scale and production above every other virtue. The men of the 5th Carrier Division were not outclassed. They were outnumbered and then outlasted. There is a difference, and it matters. Chapter 14. The Intelligence War. What each side knew and when they knew it. The history of the Pacific War cannot be fully understood without understanding the intelligence war that ran beneath and beside and often ahead of the combat operations that fill the history books. The carrier battles were not fought only by ships and aircraft. They were fought by signals, intercept analysts and cryptographers and radio operators, and the men who evaluated raw intelligence into operational picture assessments and presented those assessments to admirals who had to make decisions in minutes on the basis of information that was always incomplete and sometimes wrong. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku moved through a Pacific that was saturated with attempts by both sides to know what the other was doing, where the carriers were, where they were going, what they were carrying, when they would strike. The degree to which each side succeeded or failed in that intelligence contest shaped the outcomes of the battles that followed, sometimes as profoundly as the performance of the ships and aircraft themselves. The American success in breaking the principal Japanese naval operational code designated JN-25 by American cryptanalysts gave American commanders a strategic intelligence advantage that, at its most decisive, was arguably the most important single factor in the Battle of Midway. The ability to read Japanese operational communications imperfectly, with delays, and with the constant risk that the code would be changed or that the intelligence would be misread, provided American commanders with foreknowledge of Japanese intentions that transformed the geometry of carrier engagements. At Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz's ability to position his 3 carriers in the precise location calculated to achieve surprise against an enemy who believed the Americans did not know they were coming was a direct product of this intelligence. Advantage. The 4 Japanese carriers at Midway sailed into a trap that had been set by cryptanalysts working in a basement at Pearl Harbor as much as by the dive bomber crews who executed the attacks. The Coral Sea engagement had been shaped by American signals intelligence in a similar, if less dramatic way. American analysts had identified the Japanese plan to capture Port Moresby and the composition of the carrier force assigned to support the operation. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher's positioning of the Lexington and Yorktown to intercept the Japanese force was not a coincidence or a lucky patrol. It was a response to intelligence that had provided advance notice of Japanese intentions. The 5th Carrier Division sailed into the Coral Sea, believing it faced a weakly defended Allied position. It found instead two American fleet carriers that had been moved specifically to oppose it. The intelligence advantage did not determine the battle's outcome. The thick weather cover that hid the Zuikaku while the Shōkaku was found and bombed was a factor that no intelligence analysis could have predicted, but it determined the geography of the engagement in ways that fundamentally affected what was possible for each side. Japan's own intelligence efforts were formidable in some respects and persistently inadequate in others. Japanese naval intelligence was skilled at signals analysis and had produced, in the years before the war, an exceptionally detailed understanding of American naval dispositions, base infrastructure, and operational patterns. The planning for the Pearl Harbor attack drew on intelligence accumulated over years of careful observation: the water depths of the harbor, the routine movements of the fleet, the layout of the airfields, the timing of American patrol patterns. This was genuinely impressive intelligence work. But Japanese naval intelligence consistently struggled with one fundamental challenge: underestimating American industrial capacity and the speed of American recovery from losses. The assessments that suggested the American Navy would not be able to contest Japanese operations for 18 months after Pearl Harbor, a timeline built around the idea that American industrial output and training capacity would be too slow to rapidly replace what had been lost, proved to be wrong in ways that had consequences measured in the fates of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku and every other ship in the Japanese fleet. The Americans' ability to locate and track Japanese carrier forces through a combination of signals, intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and submarine patrol was progressively more effective as the war continued. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, the American intelligence picture of Japanese carrier movements and intentions was detailed enough to give Task Force 58 significant advance warning of the coming Japanese attack. The radar systems on American carriers could detect incoming aircraft at ranges measured in dozens of miles, giving the fighter direction officers time to position combat air patrols for maximum effect. The combination of strategic intelligence, knowing approximately where the Japanese carriers were and what they intended, and tactical intelligence, knowing in real time where the incoming strike waves were and at what altitude, gave the American defenders an advantage at the Philippine Sea that was not primarily about aircraft numbers. It was about information. The Japanese pilots flying toward the American fleet on the 19th of June, 1944, were flying into a defensive system that knew they were coming, knew roughly how many of them there were, and had positioned its fighters precisely to meet them. The outcome was not surprising to anyone who understood what that information advantage meant in practical terms. The submarine dimension of the intelligence war deserves particular attention in the context of the Shōkaku's loss. The USS Kavala, which sank the Shōkaku at the Philippine Sea, had been directed to her patrol area and given information about the movement of the Japanese fleet through a process that combined high-level strategic intelligence about the expected direction of Japanese carrier operations with the tactical judgment of the submarine's captain in executing the attack. The Kavala had actually reported contact with elements of the Japanese fleet on the 18th of June, the day before she sank the Shōkaku, and had been directed to trail and attack rather than immediately engaging, in order to give the carrier commander the most current possible picture of Japanese dispositions. The attack on the Shōkaku the following day was the outcome of a deliberate, coordinated, intelligence-driven submarine operation rather than a chance encounter. The Shōkaku's damage control crew fought heroically for hours after the torpedoes struck. The attack that put those torpedoes into her had been in preparation since before the battle began. Japanese submarine operations against American carriers achieved notable results in the earlier phases of the war. The Saratoga was torpedoed and damaged in August of 1942, and the Wasp was sunk by a Japanese submarine in September of that year. But the American anti-submarine warfare capability improved dramatically through the course of the war, and Japanese submarines were progressively redirected towards supply missions to isolated island garrisons rather than offensive operations against enemy warships. The comparison between the two submarine arms contributions to the carrier war is striking. American submarines played a direct role in the sinking of the Shōkaku, the war's most combat-tested carrier, through a coordinated intelligence-guided operation, Japanese submarines, despite early successes, never achieved a comparable result against an American fleet carrier in the later stages of the war. This asymmetry American submarines increasingly effective, Japanese submarines increasingly diverted, was itself a product of the same broader intelligence and operational dynamic that was shaping every other dimension of the conflict. The radio silence maintained by the Kidō Butai on its approach to Pearl Harbor, the extraordinary discipline of 6 carriers and their escorting vessels crossing the North Pacific for days without transmitting a single operational message was one of the most effective intelligence operations Japan conducted in the entire war. American analysts looking for the Japanese carrier force in the weeks before Pearl Harbor could not find it through radio direction finding because it was not transmitting. The operational security of the Pearl Harbor approach was a genuine achievement, one that stood in contrast to the progressively less effective Japanese communications security in the later years of the war, when the demands of coordinating complex multi-force operations made radio silence increasingly difficult to maintain and increasingly easy for American analysts to exploit. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku had sailed to Pearl Harbor in silence and achieved complete surprise. By the Philippine Sea and Cape Engano, the communications picture was different in ways that gave the American side information advantages that the Japanese could not overcome. The battle of perceptions was as important as the battle of ships, and nowhere was this more consequential than in Japanese damage assessment. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese pilots and commanders consistently overestimated the damage inflicted on American forces and underestimated American recovery rates. At the Coral Sea, Japanese aviators reported sinking or heavily damaging the Yorktown she was damaged but operational, and went on to fight at Midway 3 weeks later. At the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, and in the operations around Guadalcanal, Japanese battle damage assessments attributed to American losses a completeness that the actual results did not support. American carriers that Japanese commanders believed had been sunk or put out of action for months reappeared weeks later. The gap between perceived and actual results was not simply a problem of flawed reporting, it was a symptom of a deeper assessment culture that the Japanese Navy had not fully corrected despite the evidence of its consequences. The intelligence war that ran beneath the surface of the carrier campaign was, in its ultimate verdict, one more dimension of the broader asymmetry that defined the Pacific War's arc. Both sides were intelligent, both sides were capable of sophisticated intelligence operations, and both sides made serious analytical errors. But the Americans had the codebreakers of Station Hypo and the analytical teams at Pearl Harbor and Washington working a problem they progressively solved with increasing depth and accuracy. Japan had an intelligence apparatus that achieved remarkable things in the war's opening phase and then struggled to adapt to a conflict whose tempo and complexity exceeded its initial design parameters. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku moved through a war whose information environment became, as the years passed, increasingly unfavorable to them. They were not simply outfought. They were, in a very specific and important sense, outseen. Chapter 15 Counterfactuals and Close Calls. The moments that almost changed everything. History has a way of presenting its outcomes as inevitable as the logical, unavoidable result of the forces and decisions that preceded them. In reality, the outcome of almost any significant historical event rests on a handful of moments where things could have gone differently, where a different decision, a different weather pattern, a different position of ships by a few miles would have produced a different result that then cascaded through everything that followed. The history of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku is full of such moments, and examining them closely is not merely an exercise in speculation. It is a way of understanding what these ships actually were, what they could actually do, and what it took to stop them. The near misses and the alternative paths that were not taken illuminate the real story as much as the events that actually occurred. Begin with the Coral Sea. The Shōkaku was found and bombed in clear sky while the Zuikaku sheltered under protective cloud cover. Reverse those positions, put the Shōkaku under the clouds and the Zuikaku in the clear, and the battle's tactical result is radically different. The Zuikaku absorbs the bomb damage, and the Shōkaku, fully operational, her flight deck intact is available to continue the battle. Whether that changes the strategic outcome of the Coral Sea is uncertain. The Port Moresby invasion had already been called off before the carrier engagement, and the fundamental result of the battle, both sides' carrier forces damaged and withdrawn, might have held regardless of which ship was hit. But the specific consequence of the Coral Sea that mattered most, the damage to the Shōkaku that kept her out of Midway, and the airgroup attrition that kept the Zuikaku from sailing, flowed directly from those few miles of weather. History turned on a cloud front. The Midway counterfactual is the most discussed, and for good reason. Add the Zuikaku to the Japanese order of battle at Midway, even with a reduced air group, even with the compressed timeline of preparation that a cross-decking of surviving aircraft would have required, and you have a fifth flight deck at the engagement. The Battle of Midway was decided in a matter of minutes on the morning of the 5th of June when American dive bombers, arriving at the exact moment when the Japanese carrier's decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, and when the combat air patrol had been drawn down to low altitude by torpedo bomber attacks, caught the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu in a state of maximum vulnerability. A fifth carrier, even a partially equipped one, means a different distribution of aircraft, a different combat air patrol pattern, a different deck arrangement at the critical moment. It does not guarantee a different outcome, but it changes the geometry of the battle in ways that make the destruction of all Japanese carriers in a single morning significantly less likely. Then consider Santa Cruz. The Zuikaku emerged from that battle with her hull intact. If she had suffered the same level of flight deck damage as the Shōkaku, if 2 or 3 of the bombs that struck her sister had found the Zuikaku's deck instead, both ships would have required extensive repairs. Simultaneously, the period of Japanese carrier vulnerability in the waters around Guadalcanal, from late October 1942 onward, would have been complete rather than partial. With no operational fleet carriers in the area, the dynamics of the Guadalcanal campaign's final months might have developed differently, though whether that would have been decisive at the strategic level, given the other factors eroding Japan's position, is impossible to say with confidence. What is certain is that the Zuikaku's survival at Santa Cruz was not structurally predetermined. She emerged from that battle because of where she was, how she was positioned, and which of several converging factors worked in her favor on that particular day. The question of whether Japan could have solved its pilot quality problem with different training policies is one that goes to the root of the aircraft carrier as a weapons system, and the specifically Japanese version of it. The Japanese Navy's pre-war pilot training program was magnificent, but, by design, narrow. It was built to produce the smallest number of pilots of the highest possible individual quality, rather than large numbers of pilots of somewhat lower but still adequate competence. This was a rational doctrine for a peacetime force that planned to win wars through decisive battles rather than extended attrition. It was a catastrophically wrong doctrine for the war Japan actually fought, an alternative Japan, one that had invested in a broader, faster training pipeline in the late 1930s, one that had accepted somewhat lower individual pilot quality in exchange for much larger numbers, would have entered the carrier battles of 1942 and 1943 with a very different attrition problem. The losses would have been equally painful. The replacements would have been more readily available. The arithmetic of the decline would have been slower. Whether slower would have been slow enough to change the ultimate outcome is another matter entirely. The torpedo that struck the Zuikaku at Cape Engano during the first American strike wave forced Ozawa to transfer his flag to the light cruiser Oyodo, but it did not sink her. She kept fighting through subsequent strike waves, absorbing additional torpedo hits in the second major attack before the flooding became uncontrollable. Consider a slightly different geometry of that first torpedo hit, one that struck a less critical section of the hull, that caused flooding in a compartment the damage control party could better manage, that slowed the progressive flooding that ultimately capsized the ship. The Zuikaku might have survived another hour in the battle. She might have survived long enough for the surface action that was simultaneously developing around Leyte Gulf to resolve one way or another before she was finally overwhelmed. An extra hour of the Zuikaku's survival changes nothing strategic. The air groups that could have made her genuinely dangerous were gone. The war was already decided at levels that carrier survival could not reverse. But it changes the narrative. It changes the final entry in the log of the last Pearl Harbor carrier. History does not owe us tidier conclusions than it produces. The deepest counterfactual, the one that sits underneath all the others and gives them their weight, concerns the decision to go to war at all. Japan entered the Pacific War in December of 1941 from a position of genuine operational strength but long-term strategic weakness. The carriers, the air groups, the doctrine, the trained men all were, at that moment, as good as Japan could make them. The American industrial and manpower base was, at that moment, not yet mobilized for war at full capacity. The window existed. Whether that window could ever have been exploited for a strategic result that permanently secured Japan's objectives, rather than simply winning the opening battles while the larger forces assembled against it, is the question that underlies every other question about the Pacific War. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku were built to win the opening battles. They did, or came close. What they could not do, and what no ships, however well designed, could have done, was win a 3-year industrial war against a nation with 5 times Japan's manufacturing output and 3 times its population. The cranes flew far. They could not fly that far. The what-ifs of the Pacific Carrier War, the clouds at Coral Sea, the 5th Division's absence from Midway, the close calls at Santa Cruz and the Philippine Sea, are not simply academic exercises for historians with time on their hands. They are the evidence that the war's outcome, while influenced by structural factors of industry and resources and population, was not mechanically predetermined at the operational level. Individual decisions mattered. Weather mattered. The position of ships by miles mattered. The specific moment at which dive bombers arrived over a carrier deck crowded with armed aircraft or cleared and ready mattered enormously. The story of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku is, among other things, a story about the fragility of historical outcomes that appear, in retrospect, to have been inevitable. They were not inevitable. They were contingent, the product of 1,000 specific decisions and accidents and weather fronts and torpedo tracks, any one of which could have been different and might have changed something that followed. It is worth remembering that the men living through these events did not know the outcomes in advance. The admiral on the Shōkaku's bridge at the Coral Sea did not know that the clouds would protect the Zuikaku and expose his ship. The pilots of the 5th Division, who trained through the autumn of 1941, did not know that they would miss the most decisive battle of the war they were preparing for. The damage control party fighting to save the Shōkaku after the Cavala's torpedoes struck did not know, as they worked, whether this was another battle from which the ship could be saved, like Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, or whether this was the last one. They worked as if it could be saved because that is what they knew how to do, and because despair is not a damage control procedure. The not knowing that all these men lived inside is what makes their story something more than a strategic analysis. It makes it a human one. The counterfactuals that cluster around the history of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku ultimately point toward a single conclusion about what made these ships historically significant beyond their technical specifications or their battle records. They were, in the period of their greatest effectiveness, the instruments of a genuine possibility, the possibility that a smaller, resource-poorer nation, armed with exceptional training and exceptional doctrine and exceptional ships, could challenge and perhaps defeat a much larger opponent in the specific domain of carrier warfare. That possibility was real. It was not a delusion or a fantasy. For a period of roughly 6 months in 1941 and 42, Japan came closer to making it a reality than the subsequent history written from the perspective of the ultimate outcome tends to acknowledge. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku were the finest instruments of that possibility. Their story is, in part, the story of how far exceptional ships and exceptional men can go against structural odds and where, precisely, the limits of that possibility lie. Chapter 16. The American Perspective. What the Enemy Saw. War is always 2 stories told from opposite sides of the same event, and the history of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku looks different, sharper in some ways, more frightening in others when it is told from the perspective of the American naval officers and pilots who faced them across 3 years of the Pacific War. The American experience of the 5th Carrier Division was not the experience of facing a known quantity. It was the experience of being repeatedly surprised by the range and speed of Japanese aircraft, by the quality of Japanese naval aviators, by the capacity of these carriers to absorb punishment and keep fighting, and by the tactical skill of the commanders who operated them. Understanding how the Americans perceived and adapted to the threat represented by the Shōkaku and Zuikaku is essential to understanding the full story of both ships and of the broader carrier war they shaped. The initial American encounter with Japanese carrier aviation was, for the pilots and sailors at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December, 1941, an experience of complete and devastating surprise. The quality of the aircraft, the coordination of the attack, the precision of the strikes, none of it matched what American intelligence assessments had led naval planners to expect from Japanese carrier aviation. The pre-war American assessment of Japanese aircraft quality, shaped partly by genuine intelligence gaps and partly by the kind of casual underestimation that can afflict any military establishment looking at an opponent it has. Not yet fought was wrong in ways that cost lives immediately and shaped doctrine for months afterward. The Zero fighter, in particular, was a revelation that American pilots found profoundly unsettling. Aircraft that should not have been able to do what they were doing it with a facility and aggression that demanded immediate reassessment of everything American naval aviation thought it knew about its opponent. The Battle of the Coral Sea presented a different kind of challenge for the American side, not the shock of an unexpected attack, but the experience of fighting an enemy carrier force that was clearly capable, clearly well-trained, and clearly able to inflict serious damage even when the American side had significant intelligence advantages and was fighting from a position of preparation rather than surprise. The loss of the Lexington at the Coral Sea not just damaged but gone, sunk by the cumulative effect of torpedo and bomb damage that could not be managed, was a genuine blow that demonstrated what the 5th Carrier Division's air groups could do when they found a target in the open. Rear Admiral Fletcher's handling of the American carriers at the Coral Sea has been assessed and reassessed by historians, but the tactical context he operated in 2 Japanese fleet carriers, whose air groups were capable of the performance they ultimately demonstrated, was a genuinely difficult one. He kept one carrier operational and forced the Japanese to abandon the Port Moresby operation. That was the strategic result. The cost was considerable. The American pilots who flew against the Shōkaku and Zuikaku at the Coral Sea and Santa Cruz came away from those engagements with a specific and lasting respect for the defensive firepower and maneuvering capability of both ships. The Shōkaku, in particular, earned a reputation among American aviators as a difficult target, fast, well-defended, capable of maneuvering violently at high speed in ways that complicated attack runs and made accurate bomb placement far harder than training exercises had suggested. The pilots of the Yorktown's air group who attacked the Shōkaku at the Coral Sea reported a target that was making high-speed turns and generating a curtain of anti-aircraft fire through which they had to fly to reach. Release point. Getting the hits that wrecked her flight deck required skill, determination, and an acceptance of risk that was anything but routine. The subsequent sinking of the Shōkaku in the Philippine Sea, accomplished by a submarine rather than by carrier aircraft, was, for American naval aviators who had tried to kill her from the air at Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, a resolution that carried a certain complex irony. The development of American carrier doctrine across the war was, in significant part, a response to what the 5th Division and the broader Japanese carrier force had demonstrated about carrier warfare in its actual practice rather than its theoretical form. The radar-directed fighter direction systems that made the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot possible were the product of hard lessons learned at Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz engagements in which American combat air patrols had been too small, too poorly positioned, and too insufficiently guided to prevent Japanese strike waves from reaching and damaging American carriers. The answer was not simply more fighters, though the American carrier air groups of 1944 did carry proportionally many more Hellcat fighters than the carrier air groups of 1942 had. The more important answer was better information management, using radar data and trained fighter directors to put the right number of fighters in the right place at the right time. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku's air groups, through the damage they inflicted on American carriers in the earlier battles, directly drove the development of the system that destroyed most of Ozawa's aircraft at the Philippine Sea. The American submarine commanders who operated against Japanese carriers had their own perspective on the Shōkaku, or rather, their successors had it. Since the officers who fought the early submarine campaign against Japanese shipping were handicapped by torpedo reliability problems that were not fully solved until late in the war. The Mark 14 torpedo's defective exploder mechanism, which caused many early war torpedo attacks to fail when the weapons ran correctly but failed to detonate, was one of the most consequential technical failures in American naval history. Had reliable torpedoes been available in 1942 and 43, the impact on Japanese carrier and merchant ship survival rates would have been significant. By the time the USS Kavala put 3 functioning Mark 14s into the Shōkaku in June of 1944, the torpedo problems had been diagnosed and resolved. The Shōkaku was, in a sense, killed partly by a weapon that had taken 3 years of war to be made reliable enough to consistently do what it was designed to do. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, who commanded Task Force 58 at the Philippine Sea and whose staff managed the fighter direction that produced the Turkey Shoot, is reported to have had a complex reaction to the destruction of Japanese carrier aviation on the 19th of June, 1944. The scale of the victory was unambiguous. The Japanese had lost most of their carrier aircraft in a single day of fighting, and the Shōkaku had been sunk. But Mitcher and his staff were already thinking about the next phase of operations, about what the Japanese carrier force, however depleted, might still be able to achieve in the battles ahead, and about the persistent gap between the tactical results of an engagement and the strategic demands of the campaign. The Zuikaku was still out there. The Japanese surface forces were still formidable. The war was not over. The perspective of the victors at the Philippine Sea was not one of simple satisfaction. It was the perspective of professional naval officers who understood that the next problem was already forming beyond the horizon while they were still processing the current one. The American pilots who flew strike missions against the Zuikaku at Cape Engano on the 25th of October, 1944, were attacking a ship that, in many respects, they found harder to destroy than the battle's outcome suggests. The Zuikaku's anti-aircraft guns fired continuously through multiple strike waves. The ship maneuvered aggressively at high speed despite the damage accumulating in her lower spaces. The crews who controlled her damage in the hours between strike waves kept her afloat and fighting through the first and second attacks. The American pilots who flew the third and fourth waves against the Zuikaku were not attacking a passive, already sinking target. They were attacking a ship that was still fighting back with everything it had, crewed by men who had no intention of making their own destruction easy for the people trying to accomplish it. The multiple torpedoes required to finally capsize the Zuikaku were a measure of both the quality of her construction and the determination of her crew. What the American side ultimately took from its 3 years of engagement with the Shōkaku and Zuikaku was a body of hard-won knowledge about carrier warfare, its rhythms, its dangers, its specific requirements in terms of information, doctrine, aircraft quality, and trained personnel that shaped the way the United States Navy thought about and organized its carrier forces for the remainder of the century. The Pacific Carrier War was, for American naval aviation, a transformative experience that converted theoretical doctrine into tested operational reality under the most demanding possible conditions. The Japanese carriers that drove that transformation, the ships that taught American naval aviators, through the specific pain of engagement, what carrier warfare actually required were the Shōkaku and Zuikaku above all others. They were the enemy, and they were also, in a very specific and unsentimental military sense, teachers. The American carrier navy that dominated the post-war world was built on lessons that the 5th Carrier Division wrote in fire and salt water across 3 years of the Pacific War. Chapter 17, Legacy, Memory, and the Long Reckoning. What these ships left behind. The Shōkaku rests somewhere on the floor of the Philippine Sea, in water too deep for any salvage operation or memorial dive. The Zuikaku lies in similar depths off the northeastern coast of Luzon, in the waters where the Battle of Cape Engano was fought on the 25th of October, 1944. Neither ship has been located with the precision that would allow the kind of detailed underwater survey that has been conducted on some other Pacific War wrecks. They lie in the deep Pacific as they lived present, formidable, and largely beyond the reach of ordinary human access. Their legacy, however, is not at the bottom of any ocean. It is in the history of carrier warfare, in the development of naval aviation doctrine, in the specific technical and tactical lessons that both sides drew from their operations, and in the longer, more complicated question of what their story means, not just as military history, but as a story about human ambition, industrial power, and the limits of excellence. The technical legacy of the Shōkaku class is clearer and more easily traced than their broader strategic legacy. The design choices made by the Japanese Naval Technical Department in the mid-1930s, the large enclosed hangars, the high aircraft capacity, the powerful propulsion systems, the combination of speed and reasonable protection were recognized by naval architects and historians after the war as representing one of the most coherent and successful carrier design approaches of the pre-war and early war period. The ships achieved what their designers intended. They were fast, they carried large air groups, they were reasonably survivable against conventional attack, and they performed consistently well across a wide range of operational conditions for the better part of 3 years. The flaw, the enclosed hangar and its aviation fuel vapor risk, was a genuine and ultimately fatal design characteristic, but it was also a conscious trade-off in a design that gained significant advantages from the enclosed hangar configuration. In the overall balance of the Shōkaku-class design, informed naval architects have consistently assessed it as one of the finest carrier designs of its era. The tactical and doctrinal legacy of the 5th Carrier Division's operations runs through the entire subsequent development of carrier warfare in ways that are not always attributed to their correct source. The American Carrier Task Group concept, the organization of carriers with their escorts into self-sufficient tactical units, capable of operating and defending themselves across extended ocean distances, was refined in direct response to the challenges that Japanese carrier aviation presented in the Coral Sea, Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz engagements. The radar-directed fighter direction systems that proved so decisive at the Philippine Sea were developed and refined in explicit response to the vulnerability that Japanese strike waves had demonstrated in earlier battles. The emphasis on combat air patrol size and positioning that became standard American carrier doctrine by 1944 was in significant measure a product of the damage that the 5th Division's air groups had inflicted on American carriers before those lessons were fully learned. The Japanese carriers taught the Americans how to protect theirs. Japan's own post-war examination of its carrier program has been a more complicated and slower developing process, shaped by the specific circumstances of the war's end, the surrender, the occupation, the dismantling of the imperial military establishment, and the subsequent transformation of Japan into a pacifist democracy. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation program was not simply evaluated as a military history. It was assessed as part of a broader reckoning with the war itself, with how Japan had entered it, how it had been conducted, and what it had cost. In this reckoning, the Shōkaku and Zuikaku occupy an ambiguous position, magnificent ships, superbly executed as engineering and operational achievements, deployed in the service of a strategic enterprise that brought catastrophic destruction to Japan and to the peoples of the regions where Japan's military operated. The ships themselves were not responsible for the policy they served, but separating the evaluation of the ships from the evaluation of the war they fought in is not as simple as it might appear. The specific question of the 5th Carrier Division's role in the Pearl Harbor attack, and therefore in the initiation of America's entry into the Second World War, places the Shōkaku and Zuikaku at the center of one of the most discussed decisions in modern history. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor has been analyzed from every possible angle, as a strategic miscalculation, as a rational response to an impossible strategic situation, as a product of a specific institutional culture within the Japanese military, that made certain kinds of risk acceptance normal and certain kinds of long-term calculation difficult. Whatever analytical framework is applied to that decision, the physical agents of its execution were the aircraft that lifted from the decks of 6 carriers north of Hawaii on the 7th of December, 1941, including the decks of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku, the 2 newest, finest, and most capable carriers in the fleet. They did what they were ordered to do, with remarkable skill and at the cost of very few Japanese casualties. The consequences of what they did determined the shape of the rest of the war. The memory of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku in Japan is complicated by the larger context of the war in which they served, but within the specific community of Japanese naval history, the historians, the veterans' descendants, the naval enthusiasts, and the institutions that preserve and interpret Japan's maritime heritage, both ships are recognized as genuinely extraordinary achievements of Japanese shipbuilding and naval aviation. The Yamato Museum at Kure, which preserves the history of the naval arsenal where many Japanese warships were built or repaired, contains materials relating to the Pacific War Carrier fleet, of which the Shōkaku and Zuikaku formed the core. Veterans' associations of Japanese naval personnel kept the memories of individual ships alive through the post-war decades, with survivors of both carriers contributing testimonies that preserve the human dimension of the ship's histories, the ordinary experience of life aboard, the terror and exhilaration of combat operations, the grief of watching a ship you had lived in for years go under. In the United States, the legacy of the 5th Carrier Division is inseparable from the broader American memory of the Pacific War, a war that began with the shock of Pearl Harbor and ended with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a war that is remembered in American culture with a combination of patriotic pride and the specific moral complexity that attends any conflict of that scale and that end. The American aviators and submariners who fought against and ultimately destroyed the Shōkaku and Zuikaku are part of a generation that has mostly passed from living memory. The USS Cavallo, the submarine that sank the Shōkaku, was preserved as a museum ship at Galveston, Texas, for several decades after the war, a physical reminder of the specific act that ended the career of Japan's most combat-tested carrier. The carrier versus carrier duels at the Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz are studied at naval war colleges as foundational examples of carrier warfare, its tactics, its vulnerabilities, its specific doctrinal requirements. The wreck question, the specific fate of the physical remains of both ships, is one that has attracted periodic interest from maritime historians, underwater explorers, and the Japanese and American governments in the decades since the war. The Shōkaku lies in deep water in the Philippine Sea, her location broadly known but not yet specifically surveyed, with the precision that would allow a detailed examination of the wreck. The Zuikaku's location in the waters off Cape Engano is similarly known in broad geographic terms without the precise coordinates that would be required for a submarine survey. Both wrecks, if and when they are located and examined in detail, will be designated as war graves, the resting places of more than 1,000 men who went down with the Shōkaku and the hundreds who went down with the Zuikaku. This designation is not merely formal. The men who built and crewed these ships, who fought and died in them, are part of the story in the most permanent way possible. They are not separate from the history of the ships. They are the history of the ships. The broader legacy of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku may ultimately rest on the specific argument they make about the relationship between engineering excellence and strategic outcome. Both ships were, by the honest assessment of naval historians on all sides, among the finest carriers built by any nation in the Second World War. They were better, in certain key respects, than their American contemporaries at the time of their commissioning. They performed consistently well, tactically, operationally, in terms of ship survivability across 3 years of the most demanding naval warfare the world had experienced. And they lost. Not because they were bad ships or because their crews failed them, but because the strategic context in which they operated placed demands on them that no excellence of design or quality of crew could ultimately meet. The war Japan fought was a war that required the replacement of losses in ships, in aircraft, in trained men at a rate that Japan's industrial and demographic base could not sustain against an opponent whose industrial and demographic base was vastly larger. The 5th Carrier Division was extraordinary. It was not, in the end, extraordinary enough. The difference between those two truths is the whole story. Chapter 18. The Deep Pacific Remembers. Final reflections on two extraordinary ships. There is a particular quality to the Pacific Ocean at great depth. The light that filters down from the surface becomes attenuated and then absent. The temperature drops to a few degrees above freezing. The pressure increases to a force that no unprotected human structure could withstand. In these conditions, cold, dark, immense, the remains of the Shōkaku and the Zuikaku have lain for more than 80 years, longer than the entire period between their laying down and their sinking. The ocean that was their operational environment in life has become their permanent resting place in death. The sea that gave these ships their purpose and their identity has kept them with a finality that no memorial or museum exhibit could match. They are down there still, in the dark, as this narration reaches its end. And the question that long-form histories of this kind eventually arrive at is not a tactical question or a strategic one. It is the simpler, harder question of what it all means. Begin with what is unambiguously true. The Shōkaku and Zuikaku were, measured by any honest technical and operational standard, among the finest fleet carriers built by any nation in the Second World War. Their design was innovative, their construction was meticulous, their operational performance was consistently impressive, and their survivability under battle damage was remarkable. The Shōkaku's ability to absorb major bomb and torpedo damage 3 times and return to service is a record that no comparable carrier on any side of the war can match. They served in every major carrier engagement of the Pacific War from Pearl Harbor onward, with the singular and consequential exception of Midway. They contributed to the destruction of American carrier air power at the Coral Sea, the Eastern Solomons, and Santa Cruz, in ways that shaped the entire trajectory of the Pacific Carrier War. They were, in every sense that matters in naval history, extraordinary ships. This is the baseline from which any fair assessment of their story must begin. The arc of their decline from the peak of their effectiveness in the Kidō Butai of 1941 to the hollow decoy force of Cape Engano in 1944 is not a story of ships becoming less capable. The ships themselves did not decline. The Zuikaku that sailed to Cape Engano was mechanically identical, or nearly so, to the Zuikaku that had struck Pearl Harbor. What declined was the ecosystem of trained human expertise that made them genuinely formidable. The airgroups, the experienced pilots, the deep collective knowledge of carrier operations that had been built through years of intensive pre-war training and refined through the specific hard lessons of combat experience. That ecosystem could not be regenerated at the pace at which it was consumed. The training pipeline, however hard it worked, could not produce in months what it had taken years to build. This is the thread that runs from Coral Sea through Midway, through Santa Cruz and the Philippine Sea, all the way to Cape Engano, not a failure of ships or strategy, in the first instance, but a failure of replaceable resources in the face of a war that demanded more of them than Japan possessed. The Shōkaku's last hours on the 19th of June, 1944, are a study in the specific tension between human capability and physical limit. The damage control parties who worked to save her after the Cavala's torpedoes struck were doing what they had always done, applying the skills and the organization and the determination that had saved the ship twice before. The fires they fought were real fires, the flooding they battled was real flooding, and the effort they brought to both was as genuine as anything that had been brought to the ship's defense in any of her previous battles. The internal explosion that overcame all of that effort was not a judgment on the quality of the people who worked to prevent it. It was the consequence of a design characteristic that no amount of courage could neutralize once the right conditions had been created by battle damage. The Shōkaku died of a vulnerability that her designers had identified and accepted as an unavoidable trade-off. The acceptance of that trade-off was a choice made in a drawing office in the 1930s. The consequences of that choice arrived irreversibly in the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. The Zuikaku's end at Cape Engano has a different character, less the consequence of a specific design flaw and more the consequence of pure, overwhelming force applied by an enemy that had grown, in 3 years of industrial mobilization and operational experience, into something that no single ship could resist indefinitely. She was hit by torpedo after torpedo from successive strike waves. She absorbed damage that would have ended other ships earlier. She kept fighting through it with a stubbornness that was consistent with everything the ship had always been. And then, the flooding overcame the damage control, the list became unrecoverable, and the flag came down for the last time. The crew's final salute standing on the tilting deck, rendering honours to the imperial standard as it was lowered, is one of the most humanly resonant moments in the entire history of these two ships. It was not a gesture of defiance or a performance of ideology. It was the thing that sailors do when a ship they have lived in and fought from and cared for is going down a formal acknowledgement of the end of something that mattered, conducted with the specific dignity that maritime tradition provides for exactly these moments. The question of what the Pacific Carrier War ultimately proved about naval warfare, about what aircraft carriers could and could not do, about the relationship between technological excellence and strategic outcome, about the organizational and human requirements of carrier aviation is a question that the histories written in the decades since the war have answered in many different ways. What seems consistently true, looking at the full arc of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku's careers, is that carrier warfare in the Pacific was above all a human endeavor dependent on trained people, on accumulated expertise, on the specific institutional knowledge that a fighting unit develops through shared experience and that cannot be rapidly replicated once it has been lost. The ships were instruments. The trained men who operated them were the essential component. Japan's failure to sustain its initial advantage in trained carrier aviators was not an accident or a product of bad luck. It was the consequence of a pre-war doctrine that optimized for quality over quantity in a war that ultimately demanded both. The specific human cost of the 5th Carrier Division's 3 years of war is a number that deserves to be held in mind as this history draws toward its close. More than 1,200 men went down with the Shōkaku in the Philippine Sea. Hundreds more were lost with the Zuikaku at Cape Engano. Hundreds of pilots and aircrew from both carriers' air groups were lost in the engagements from Pearl Harbor onward, at the Coral Sea, at the Eastern Solomons, at Santa Cruz, in the Indian Ocean, in the skies above Guadalcanal and the Philippine Sea. The men who maintained these ships, who flew from their decks, who fought their fires and manned their guns, came from families and communities and a nation that had sent them to war and received back, in many cases, nothing. The strategic arguments about carrier doctrine and industrial capacity and the arithmetic of attrition are important for understanding the war. The individual human cost of the war is important for understanding what the arguments were ultimately about. The Pacific War ended in August of 1945, less than a year after the Zuikaku went down at Cape Engano. The strategic trajectory that the loss of the Shōkaku and Zuikaku and of the broader Japanese carrier aviation capability they represented had made irreversible was completed in those final months through the combination of conventional bombing, naval blockade, and ultimately the use of atomic weapons that forced Japan's surrender. The specific contribution of the 5th Carrier Division's defeat to the final outcome is not easily quantified. Wars do not have single causes or single turning points, but the destruction of Japan's carrier aviation, of which the 5th Division's losses were the central and most consequential part, removed the one instrument that had given Japan genuine strategic reach across the program's Pacific. Without that reach, the defensive perimeter could not be held. Without the perimeter, the home islands could not be protected.